Hey everyone! Welcome back to another long, quiet wander through history's softer shadows. Tonight we begin a series that follows not the glitter of empires or the noise of battles, but something far quieter and far more relentless. Hunger. Across centuries, across continents. Famine returned again and again, shaping kingdoms, breaking dynasties, and reminding rulers that even power bends before an empty harvest. This will be a slow story, one that drifts through empty granaries, failed rains, and the silent struggles of ordinary people whose hunger bent the arc of history more than swords or crowns ever could. So before we start, take a moment to gently tap the subscribe button so you don't miss the night still to come in this long journey. And if you'd like, leave a note in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's always a strange comfort to know this quiet corner of history is being shared across the world at once. Now let the lights dim, let your breathing slow, and let the day recede behind you. Tonight we begin with the first step on this path, the age before kings and cities, when the domestication of humble grains in the Fertile Crescent set humanity on a course that could never be undone. It begins in a silence older than writing, in a landscape neither entirely wild nor entirely settled. The Fertile Crescent, that long bending arc of land stretching from the river valleys of Mesopotamia through the Levant and down toward the Nile, appears today as a map in textbooks, a cradle of civilization outlined in neat borders and shaded colors. But before it was a cradle, before it nurtured empires and monumental stone cities, it was simply a region of shifting soils and scattered grasses, and among those grasses grew the seeds that would bind humanity to a new rhythm. One measured not by wandering herds or the chase of game, but by the slow, unending cycle of the harvest. The earliest evidence takes us back more than 10,000 years, into the Neolithic, when small bands of humans began to pause their wanderings, lingering longer in valleys where wild stands of wheat and barley grew in dense clusters. At first it was no more than an experiment of convenience. Grains, after all, are not immediately generous foods. They are small, hard, resistant. They demand fire and grinding stones, long hours of work, before they yield their nourishment. Yet in the right hands with the right patience, they offered something more precious than mere taste. They could last. While hunted meat spoiled quickly in the warmth of the Levantine sun, a store of dried seeds endured, tucked away in clay pots or woven baskets. Hunger, once an urgent shadow pressing from one day into the next, could now be delayed, postponed, managed. It is easy, from the distance of millennia, to imagine this shift as sudden, decisive, even purposeful. But the truth is slower, blurred by generations. The domestication of emmer wheat, inkhorn wheat and barley did not arrive like conquest or invention. It unfolded quietly, gradually as small choices accumulated. A woman scattering a handful of seeds near the encampment after processing grain, a child noticing that certain patches sprouted taller stalks, a group returning to a familiar site year after year, each time finding the grasses thicker, more familiar. Step by step, the plants themselves changed, reshaped by human hands without deliberate design. Seeds that clung less tightly to their husks, that fell more predictably into waiting baskets, were gathered more often, sown more often, passed down more often. And so, domestication crept forward, unrecorded and unnoticed by those living it, but decisive all the same. The rhythm of life bent with it. To cultivate, one had to stay. To sow seeds in autumn, and reap them in late spring meant returning to the same ground, season after season. And so, huts became villages, villages became clusters, and clusters became something new. The first glimmers of settlement. The earth itself demanded this stillness. Crops needed tending, irrigation channels needed clearing, weeds needed pulling, and the harvest, above all, needed watching. For grain could be stolen by animals, trampled by storms, or devoured by strangers. The dependence was total, and it was irreversible. From this slow tethering came a new relationship to time. For hunter-gatherers, time had been flexible, shaped by migration routes, by the movement of herds, by the ripening of wild fruits. In agricultural life, time narrowed, hardened, and looped. The year became a circle of labor, plowing, sowing, watching, waiting, reaping, storing, Hunger no longer came as an irregular guest, appearing in harsh winters or unlucky hunts. Now it was systematic, its threat woven into the very fabric of survival. A mist flood, an untimely frost, a swarm of insects. Each could undo a year's worth of effort. The cycle promised abundance, but it also promised scarcity on a scale never before known. In the Fertile Crescent, this cycle intertwined with water. The twin rivers of Mesopotamia, the Tigris and the Euphrates, carried silt from distant mountains, flooding fields with nutrients, but also with danger. Irrigation, once devised, deepened the commitment to the soil. Channels had to be dug, maintained, defended. Neighbors had to coordinate, or quarrel, over the division of streams. In Egypt, the Nile's predictable rise and fall offered a more measured gift, but it too demanded observation, planning, and storage. Everywhere, grain turned rivers into lifelines and landscapes into contested ground. The abundance it offered was both blessing and trap. Grain could be stored, yes, but it also had to be stored. A good harvest meant surplus, and surplus meant more mouths could be fed, leading, in turn, to more people. The population grew, tethered to the grain that sustained it, until any failure became catastrophic. What had once been a small group's hunger could now become a famine, spreading across a village, a region, an entire valley. Dependency scaled, and with it, vulnerability. The earliest granaries, archaeologists tell us, were simple affairs: clay-lined pits, dug into the earth, plastered baskets tucked into huts, mud brick silos raised against the air. They were practical, but they were also symbolic. Stored grain represented both survival and power. Those who controlled it, who measured it, guarded it, distributed it, held sway over others. And here, in the simple act of counting sacks of barley, we see the faint outlines of future hierarchies. Chiefs, priests, kings. Power, once measured by the strength to hunt, or the wisdom to guide a clan, now bent toward whoever could promise bread in the lean months. It is no accident that the first written records we find in Mesopotamia are not songs or stories, but tallies of grain, clay tablets, pressed with neat cuneiform marks, record measures of barley owed, rations allotted, debts collected. The act of writing itself may well have been born out of hunger, or at least out of the management of hunger. Civilization's great leap forward was less about poetry and philosophy, and more about the careful keeping of grain accounts. When we step back, the picture sharpens. Humanity did not march into civilization under banners and war cries. It shuffled into it carrying baskets of seeds. The empires of the future, with their armies, their monuments, and their religions, rested on this quiet foundation. Without grain, there would be no cities, no kingdoms, no dynasties. But with grain came an unending bargain. Abundance tied to dependence, harvests tied to hunger. The soil gave, but it also demanded, and once humanity accepted its terms, there was no turning back. So the story of hunger begins not with famine, but with this tethering to the earth, with the promise of full granaries, and the shadow of empty ones. Grain before empires, grain before kings, grain before history itself. The endless hunger that would devour kingdoms was born here, quietly, in the fields of the Fertile Crescent, where humanity traded freedom for stability, and found both abundance and the shadow of want. In the long arc of human history, there are few rivers more essential, more constant in memory, than the Nile. It is not simply a river, it is a rhythm, a heartbeat that pulsed through the daily life of ancient Egypt for millennia. Each year, as predictably as the turning of the seasons, the Nile would rise with summer rains from distant Ethiopian highlands, swelling its banks, spreading dark silt across the floodplain, and leaving behind the fertile ground on which Egyptian life depended. This cycle was not just agricultural, it was spiritual, political, even cosmic. The Nile's inundation was Egypt's promise, its security, its anchor against the chaos of desert stretching endlessly on either side. And yet, for all its constancy, the Nile was not immune to failure, and when it failed, Egypt discovered how fragile even the most seemingly eternal prosperity could be. The prosperity of Egypt, unlike the precarious settlements of the Fertile Crescent, rested on this seasonal gift. The soil renewed itself each year with fertile deposits, sparing Egyptian farmers the endless toil of crop rotation and heavy fertilization that plagued other lands. Wheat, barley, flax, vegetables, all sprang from the narrow green belt along the river, making Egypt one of the most agriculturally productive regions of the ancient world. Greek and Roman writers, centuries later, would marvel at how Egypt could feed not only its own people, but also sustain empires abroad with grain shipments. The Nile's predictability became so embedded in Egyptian thought that kingship itself was tied to the river. A successful pharaoh was one who ensured Ma'at, the cosmic balance, and a generous Nile flood was taken as evidence of divine favor. But the Nile was not a machine, it was a living system, its waters dependent on distant rains, on weather patterns that no Egyptian could see or control. And in certain years, perhaps once or twice in a generation, the river would rise too little, or not at all. The fertile silt would fail to spread, the soil would harden, the crops would wither, and with each passing week of dryness, anxiety grew into fear, and fear into hunger. The Egyptian records that survive speak indirectly of these years, often in tones of lament or ritual appeal. The most famous is the so-called Famine stela, an inscription carved during the Ptolemaic period, but set in the distant reign of King Djoser, nearly 2,600 years earlier. It tells of 7 years of famine, when the Nile failed to flood and people starved. Whether the account reflects an actual memory of such a disaster or a later symbolic story is debated, but the anxiety it conveys is genuine. In the stela, the people cry out, temples are empty, fields are barren and hunger gnaws at the land. Only by restoring divine rituals and recognizing Canaan, the god said to control the Nile's waters, could balance be returned. Hunger here is not merely physical but cosmic, a breach in the order of the world. For the common farmer, the reality of a failed flood was less poetic. When the waters did not rise, fields dried to dust. Without the natural irrigation of the inundation, even the ingenious basins and canals Egyptians dug could not sustain crops. Livestock grew thin, grain stores dwindled, and rations became tighter. Hunger crept steadily, not in sudden catastrophe, but in the grinding absence of bread and beer, the staples of daily survival. The granaries, usually filled with surplus in good years, emptied quickly when taxed by both households and the state. What had been abundance turned to scarcity, and scarcity turned to desperation. Egypt's political and religious institutions, so deeply tied to the Nile's cycle, felt the strain. A pharaoh who presided over years of failed floods risked not only unrest but the very legitimacy of his rule. Priests, tasked with interceding through ritual, found their authority questioned when prayers brought no water. Communities strained as neighbors competed for dwindling supplies. Hunger, more than invading armies or palace intrigue, exposed the delicate fabric of Egyptian society. The environmental causes of these Nile failures are better understood today. Scholars link them to irregularities in East African rainfall, influenced by larger climatic systems such as the Indian Ocean monsoon, or even shifts like El Niño. Modern hydrological studies suggest that such disruptions were not common, but when they occurred, they had devastating ripple effects. In the 2nd millennium BCE, texts and archaeological evidence indicate several episodes of prolonged drought that coincided with periods of political turmoil. Some historians argue that the collapse of Egypt's Old Kingdom around 2200 BCE was tied, at least in part, to such a prolonged famine, when the Nile's waters failed to rise adequately for decades. Whether or not famine alone caused political collapse, its weight on the population was undeniable. Hunger alters everything. It erodes trust, it amplifies inequality, it transforms everyday endurance into a test of survival. In Egypt, where grain was currency, where taxes were measured in wheat and barley, famine meant both personal suffering and state crisis. A poor family might watch their children waste away, but a pharaoh might watch his authority dissolve in riots at granaries or unrest in distant nomes. Both were bound by the same river, the same absent waters. The Nile's failures also shaped how Egyptians imagined the afterlife. The field of reeds, the eternal paradise promised to the righteous, was imagined as a land of unending harvest, where grain grew tall and bread was plentiful. This vision was not of palaces or jewels, but of abundance at table, a world where hunger was banished forever. It suggests just how deeply famine haunted the Egyptian imagination. Paradise itself was freedom from failed floods. And yet, for all its devastation, the Nile remained central, its rhythm largely reliable over the centuries. Famines, though terrible, were relatively rare compared to the more fragile agricultural systems of other regions. Egypt's longevity, as a civilization, owed much to this reliability, but that very reliance made the exceptions all the more traumatic. When the river faltered, it was not just a natural disaster, it was an existential one, shaking the foundations of identity, religion, and power. So the story of hunger moves forward, from the scattered grains of the Fertile Crescent to the swelling and failing waters of the Nile. Humanity's fate was bound ever tighter to cycles it could not fully control. Each abundance carried the shadow of scarcity, each harvest the memory of hunger. The endless hunger that devoured kingdoms did not wait for wars or plagues. It began in the river valleys themselves, where prosperity rested on the uncertain generosity of water. The story of hunger in Egypt is not told only in barren fields or in empty granaries. It is also told in stone, in inscriptions carved centuries after the events they claim to recall, but no less revealing for their distance from fact. Among these, one of the most haunting is the Famine stela, carved on the cliffs of Sihel Island near Aswan during the Ptolemaic period, but set in the reign of the ancient King Djoser, who ruled more than 2,000 years earlier. Its words are not a historian's record, but a carefully shaped memory, a story meant to explain, to reassure, and to bind together religion, kingship, and the enduring fear of failed harvests. The stela describes 7 years of drought, 7 years in which the Nile refused to flood, 7 years of hunger that gripped the land. In the text, Djoser is portrayed as a ruler confronted with this disaster. Temples stand empty, offerings cease, people starve, desperation hangs over the kingdom. It is Imhotep, the king's famed vizier and architect, who seeks out knowledge, consulting archives, prayers and omens, until he identifies the source of Egypt's plight. The god Khnum, master of the Nile's waters and creator of life, has been neglected. His temple at Elephantine has fallen into disrepair, his rituals forgotten. The famine, in this telling, is not simply a failure of rain or river. It is the manifestation of divine displeasure, a cosmic imbalance mirrored in the physical world. The resolution comes through restoration. Djoser, guided by Imhotep, honors Khnum with new offerings, repairs his temple, and re-establishes proper worship. The god, appeased, restores the Nile's flood, and abundance returns to the land. The stela concludes not only with relief, but with a decree: lands and revenues are to be dedicated to Khnum's temple, ensuring the god's worship and the river's flow for generations. On the surface, the Famine stela reads like myth, a tale crafted to explain the inexplicable. Scholars recognize that the inscription, composed centuries after the supposed events, was likely intended to justify the privileges of Khnum's temple at Elephantine under the Ptolemies. It is a charter story, grounded in contemporary rites and ancient authority, yet its imagery of famine, and its linkage of hunger to divine will reveal something deeper. It shows how Egyptians understood scarcity not as random misfortune, but as a sign of broken order, a warning that the bond between humans, gods and land had been disturbed. This perspective was not unique to the stela. In Egyptian thought, Matar, the principle of cosmic harmony, governed all things. The pharaoh, as guarantor of Matar, bore responsibility not just for justice or military defense, but for the fertility of the land itself. A good flood was proof of his legitimacy, a failed flood was a crack in his authority. Hunger was not merely natural disaster, it was political and spiritual crisis. Omens, dreams and inscriptions reinforced this view. Texts from different periods describe famine as times when temples grew silent, when processions halted, when the gods turned their faces away. Even in later eras, under foreign rulers, the idea endured: to control Egypt, one had to ensure that the Nile flowed and the people were fed. The divine interpretation of hunger was not an optional belief, but the very framework by which Egyptians understood survival. The Famine stela, with its 7 lean years, also echoes a motif that would reappear across cultures. In Mesopotamia, omens of 7-year famines were inscribed on tablets. In the Hebrew Bible, the story of Joseph speaks of 7 years of plenty followed by 7 years of want. Whether the Egyptian inscription influenced these later traditions or reflects a shared memory of drought cycles, the number itself, 7, carried symbolic weight, a completeness of suffering that could only be relieved by divine intervention. The physical setting of the stela also matters. Carved into granite cliffs near Aswan, close to the quarries that supplied stone for Egypt's monuments, it was positioned in a landscape tied to both abundance and endurance. The island of Sahel was a place where inscriptions of many kinds accumulated, records of expeditions, dedications to gods, marks of authority. By placing the famine story there, its authors tied hunger into a broader tapestry of memory, one visible to travelers, quarry workers, priests and officials. It was both a warning and a reassurance, an eternal reminder that famine had been faced before and overcome through proper devotion. To modernize the famine stela may seem distant, even decorative, its narrative more symbolic than historical, yet it encapsulates something universal about how societies confront scarcity. Hunger, when it strikes, demands explanation. It is too vast, too devastating, to be left to chance. In Egypt, explanation came through gods and kings, through ritual and inscription. To tell the story of famine was not merely to recall suffering, it was to shape the response, to bind future generations into patterns of worship and obligation that promised protection against hunger's return. And so, as the Nile rose and fell, as fields flourished and failed, the memory of famine became part of Egypt's religious DNA. Carved in stone, told in myth, whispered in prayers, it reminded Egyptians that prosperity was fragile, that divine favor was essential, and that hunger lurked always at the edge of abundance. In this way, the famine stela is not just a record of one imagined crisis, it is a monument to the psychology of hunger itself, the need to make sense of scarcity, to anchor suffering in narrative, to believe that through ritual and reverence, the chaos of want could be held at bay. It is a stone echo of the endless hunger that haunted kingdoms, a hunger too vast to ignore, too constant to ever be fully silenced. If Egypt was blessed with the steady rhythm of a river that rarely failed, Mesopotamia lived in the uneasy tension of extremes. To its west stretched the deserts of Syria, to its east the highlands of Persia, to its north, the grasslands that rolled toward Anatolia. At its heart lay 2 rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates, rushing down from distant mountains, carving their way into wide alluvial plains. This was the land between rivers, the cradle of cities, the stage of the world's earliest states, and yet, for all its fertility, it was also a land of risk. The rivers gave life, but they also brought ruin, flooding unpredictably, shifting courses, and demanding constant labor to tame. When rains faltered in the north, when snowmelt dwindled, or when political turmoil disrupted irrigation, the carefully balanced system broke down. In Mesopotamia, the granary was never far from emptiness. The earliest Neolithic settlements in this region, long before the rise of Uruk or Babylon, began with the same tethering to grain that marked the Fertile Crescent as a whole. Barley and wheat, alongside lentils and chickpeas, were cultivated on floodplains where irrigation could extend their reach. With these harvests came surpluses, and with surplus came population growth, specialization, and the clustering of people into villages that grew steadily into towns. By the 4th millennium BCE, these towns swelled into true city-states: Uruk, Lagash, Eridu, each with its temples, its walls, its rulers, its rituals. Civilization, in its earliest form, emerged here in brick and reed. But from the beginning, this civilization was fragile. The agricultural system relied heavily on irrigation, which in turn depended on complex networks of canals. These canals had to be dug, cleared, defended, and maintained season after season. Silt clogged them, weeds choked them, breaches ruined them. Without cooperative labor, without central authority to organize the effort, the fields dried or drowned. And so, the very system that allowed cities to rise also demanded structures of power: kings, priests, bureaucracies, and scribes. who tallied grain in clay tablets. Even in years of plenty, granaries were never symbols of permanence. Grain was stored against lean years, but the surpluses were modest and the pressures immense. Populations rose, trade expanded, armies demanded rations, and temples consumed offerings. In such a finely tuned balance, it took only a few poor harvests to bring crisis. Archaeological evidence reveals layers of abandonment, collapsed walls, and sudden declines in settlement patterns, signs that drought and famine periodically swept the land, emptying granaries and scattering populations. One of the most dramatic examples comes from the period known as the 4.2 kiloyear event, around 2200 BCE. Across much of the ancient Near East, climate shifted abruptly, droughts lengthened, rains diminished, and river flows weakened. In Mesopotamia, these changes undermined the Akkadian Empire, often described as the world's first empire, forged under Sargon of Akkad and his successors. The Akkadians had stretched their power across the Fertile Crescent, but their cohesion rested on the steady flow of grain and tribute. When drought struck, harvests failed, and famine spread. Cuneiform texts from this time speak of cities abandoned, of fields that produced no grain, of people forced to migrate in search of sustenance. Archaeologists have found evidence of widespread dust storms and aridification, conditions that would have devastated agriculture. The empire, unable to feed its population, unraveled. Even beyond such dramatic collapses, hunger was a constant companion. Mesopotamian records, more numerous than those of Egypt, preserve glimpses of ration lists and grain allocations. Workers in temple households or palace projects were often paid in measures of barley, carefully calculated and recorded. When supplies tightened, rations shrank. Hunger was not always famine. It could be the slow grinding insufficiency of daily bread, cut thinner, beer brewed weaker, debts accumulated faster. For the poor, scarcity meant not simply empty stomachs, but the selling of children into servitude, the loss of land to creditors, the descent into dependency. Hunger was both physical and social, reshaping hierarchies and binding the weak to the powerful. The gods, as always, were drawn into the story. Just as Egyptians saw famine as divine displeasure, so too did Mesopotamians read drought and scarcity as signs of cosmic imbalance. Their myths reflect this anxiety. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, famine and flood appear as instruments of divine will, tools through which gods chastise or correct human pride. Rituals and offerings were intended to secure divine favor, to ensure that barley fields flourished and dates ripened on their palms. Priests interpreted omens, the flight of birds, the entrails of sacrificed animals, the shape of clouds, for signs of whether the coming harvest would sustain or fail. Hunger thus entered into religion, as both warning and punishment, an ever-present possibility lurking at the edges of prosperity. And yet in Mesopotamia, hunger was also a spur to ingenuity. The precariousness of agriculture drove innovation in irrigation, record-keeping, law, and trade. Grain shortages forced city-states to reach beyond their borders, seeking supplies through caravans, boats, and conquest. The famous Code of Hammurabi, centuries later, contains laws regulating agricultural contracts, irrigation maintenance, and the punishment of neglect, a legal reflection of how central food security was to justice itself. Hunger in this sense was both threat and teacher, shaping the institutions that allowed Mesopotamian civilization to endure despite its fragility. Still, the empty granaries left scars. Archaeological surveys show that settlements often contracted during periods of drought, populations retreating to areas where irrigation could still function. Abandoned towns dotted the landscape, their mud brick walls eroded back into the soil. Each collapse was not a final end but a reset, a reminder of the narrow margin on which life was balanced. Hunger was cyclical, rising and falling with the rivers, with the rains, with the unpredictable turns of climate. Compared to Egypt, where famine struck less frequently but with deep trauma, Mesopotamia lived in a state of uneasy vigilance. Abundance could be great, but it was never taken for granted. The empty granary was a memory never far from mind, a caution that prosperity was temporary and fragile. It was this awareness that perhaps gave Mesopotamian culture its restless quality, building, rebuilding, recording, regulating, always aware that the rivers could betray them. And so, hunger became part of the DNA of the earliest cities. It was carved into their laws, embedded in their myths, and visible in their ruins. The endless hunger that devoured kingdoms began here, in the land between rivers, where the promise of abundance was shadowed by the threat of drought, and where every full granary carried within it the fear of emptiness. In the lands that bordered the Aegean Sea, where stony hillsides sloped down into narrow coastal plains, and jagged archipelagos dotted the waters, the story of hunger took on a distinct character. Greece was never a land of deep, fertile river valleys like Egypt or Mesopotamia. Its soil was thin, often rocky, suited for olives and vines, but less generous for grain. Rainfall was unreliable, winters modest, summers dry and long. The terrain, fragmented by mountains, divided communities into small polities, city-states that clung to their limited fields and relied heavily on the uncertain rhythm of harvests. Hunger in Greece was not rare catastrophe, but persistent tension, an undercurrent that shaped its politics, its colonization, and the rise of rulers who promised bread in times of want. From the earliest days of the polis, the Greek city-state food supply was a central problem. A community's independence, its freedom to govern itself, rested precariously on whether its granaries could remain full. Many polis possessed only narrow strips of cultivable land, often enough for subsistence but rarely abundant. As populations grew in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, this pressure deepened. Archaeological evidence shows signs of soil exhaustion, deforestation, and overgrazing on Greek hillsides, signs that fields strained under repeated use. When harvests faltered, hunger forced communities to look outward. Colonization became, in part, a response to this endless pressure. Greek ships set out across the Aegean, into the Black Sea, along the coasts of Italy, Sicily, and even as far as France and Spain. These colonies were not simply adventures of trade and culture, but lifelines to new fields and fresh supplies of grain. Cities such as Miletus, Corinth, and Megara planted colonies that could export wheat back to the mother city, alleviating shortages at home. Athens, famously, would later depend heavily on grain imports from the fertile plains around the Black Sea, transported across long sea routes and guarded carefully against disruption. In this way, hunger shaped the very geography of the Greek world, scattering its culture across the Mediterranean basin. Within the city-states themselves, scarcity often spilled into politics. When harvests failed, the poor suffered first and most, as debts piled and food prices rose. In many places, farmers unable to meet obligations found themselves losing land or sold into debt bondage. This created simmering unrest, fertile ground for political change. The rise of tyrants in Greece, rulers who seized power outside traditional aristocratic frameworks, is closely tied to this landscape of hunger. In the 7th and 6th centuries BCE, tyrants emerged in cities like Corinth, Megara, and Athens, often presenting themselves as champions of the poor. While the word tyrant would later take on harsh connotations, in early Greece it often signified a pragmatic figure who promised relief in times of want. Cypselus of Corinth, for example, rose amid tensions between wealthy aristocrats and struggling commoners, capitalizing on discontent that hunger had sharpened. In Megara, the Aegenes seized power with the support of poorer citizens, reportedly slaughtering the cattle of the wealthy to ease food shortages. Most famously, in Athens, the crisis of hunger intertwined with the crisis of debt. By the early 6th century BCE, many small farmers had fallen into such deep obligation that they pledged themselves and their families into servitude. The city simmered with unrest, threatening collapse. It was Solon, not a tyrant but a reformer given extraordinary power, who enacted the seisatia, the shaking off of burdens, cancelling debts and freeing those enslaved for them. His measures were, at root, an attempt to restore balance in a society strained by food insecurity. Hunger had pressed Athens to the brink, and the political order reshaped itself in response. Beyond these crises, grain itself became a political instrument. Control of supply routes, ownership of fertile plains, and access to imported wheat were levers of power. In Athens, The rise of the democracy in the 5th century BCE coincided with the development of a maritime empire that ensured steady grain flows from subject territories and allies. Ships brought wheat from the Black Sea, barley from Egypt, and other staples that kept the population of Athens nourished enough to sustain its political experiments and cultural flowering. Hunger, always in the background, was managed by networks of trade and tribute. But hunger never fully disappeared. During wars, supply routes were threatened, sieges starved cities, and blockades turned hunger into a weapon. The Peloponnesian War between Athens and Sparta in the late 5th century BCE saw cities starved into surrender, while Athens itself suffered shortages as its enemies cut off access to key grain routes. Famines were not simply natural disasters, they were tools of strategy, political crises, and reminders of the fragility of Greek prosperity. Religion, too, absorbed the presence of hunger. Greek myths often linked agricultural failure to divine displeasure. The story of Demeter and Persephone, with its cycle of fertility and barrenness, can be read as a mythic reflection of seasonal scarcity and the anxiety of failed harvests. Rituals, sacrifices, and festivals sought to honor deities who could ensure abundance. At Eleusis, the mysteries of Demeter promised initiates some comfort against the fear of famine and death, intertwining the rhythms of agriculture with the spiritual life of Greece. Hunger, then, was never merely an absence of food. It was the silent force behind voyages of colonization, the hidden hand in the rise of tyrants, the trigger of reforms, and the ever-present shadow over democracy's bright experiments. The Greek world, famed for its philosophy, art, and politics, was also a world that looked anxiously each year to its granaries, knowing that freedom itself could not endure if the fields and the markets stood empty. By the time the Greek city-states reached their classical heights, hunger had been woven into their institutions. Colonies stretched across seas to bring back wheat, assemblies debated grain prices and imports, armies marched to secure fertile plains. Even the philosophers, in their abstract musings, recognized the primacy of sustenance. Aristotle, reflecting on the polis, noted that the household and its provision of necessities lay at the foundation of civic life. The lofty ideals of Greek political thought rested on the humble, uncertain harvest of barley and wheat. And so, the endless hunger that devoured kingdoms made its mark on Greece, not as sudden catastrophe, but as constant tension, shaping the contours of colonization, tyranny, and democracy alike. The Greek polis, for all its brilliance, was always a little hungry, always aware that its independence was only as firm as its next harvest, its next shipment of grain across uncertain seas. The city of Rome, rising first from a cluster of huts on the banks of the Tiber, grew into an empire that stretched across continents. Yet as its borders expanded, and its legions marched outward, Rome remained tethered to something far humbler than conquest or glory. It was bound, with a quiet but unbreakable chain, to the steady flow of grain. More than armies, more than laws, more even than its famous roads, the empire's cohesion depended on the annona, the supply of food to the people of the city. From its earliest days as a republic, Rome had been uneasy with hunger. The land surrounding the city, though fertile in parts, was never sufficient for its swelling population. By the 3rd century BCE, as Rome absorbed Italy, its citizens increasingly crowded into the capital, relying not on their own fields, but on tribute and imports from conquered territories. What had begun as a community of farmers, transformed into a metropolis, whose survival rested on grain carried from afar. The state quickly recognized this dependency, and with it, the political danger that hunger posed. Roman politics was, in many ways, shaped by the struggle between elites and common citizens, the patricians and plebeians, whose demands often centered on access to land and food. Grain distributions, first ad hoc and later systematized, became a tool to ease unrest. By the late Republic, leaders competed to win popular support by promising cheaper grain or larger rations. Gaius Gracchus, in the 2nd century BCE, famously introduced laws to regulate grain prices, providing subsidies to the poor. These reforms were controversial, sparking fierce opposition from the Senate, but they also demonstrated the raw power of hunger to shape policy. As Rome transitioned into empire, food distribution became not simply policy but institution. Augustus, consolidating power after decades of civil war, recognized that the loyalty of the people of Rome hinged on a stable supply of bread. He formalized the annona system, ensuring regular distributions of grain to eligible citizens. This was not mere charity, it was political necessity. The bread of the people became the cornerstone of imperial rule, binding masses of urban poor to the emperor's benevolence. Alongside bread came spectacle, the famous bread and circuses, a pairing that sought to pacify citizens with both sustenance and distraction. The logistics of feeding Rome were immense. By the 1st century CE, the city may have held over 1 million inhabitants. To sustain them, vast shipments of wheat arrived each year, primarily from Egypt and North Africa. The fertile floodplains of the Nile, now securely under Roman control, became the empire's breadbasket. Grain ships sailed from Alexandria across the Mediterranean, their cargoes so critical that fleets were organized to protect them. Inscriptions and records speak of the vast scale of this system, hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat moving annually to keep Rome's ovens warm. The annona, however, was not merely economic, it was political in the deepest sense. When supplies faltered, unrest flared, riots erupted in the forum. When shipments were delayed, prices spiked, or corrupt officials mishandled distributions. Emperors who failed to maintain the grain supply risked their very rule. One of the sharpest examples came during the reign of Claudius in the 1st century CE. When storms disrupted shipments, grain shortages led to near riots in the city. Claudius himself had to step forward, assuring the people of his commitment to their welfare, and personally overseeing measures to secure future supplies. Roman historians were acutely aware of this tension. Tacitus, Suetonius, and others recorded the anxieties of rulers who recognized that the empire's grandeur rested on fragile ships crossing uncertain seas. Political crises often unfolded not on battlefields, but in breadlines. Hunger could topple reputations, spark conspiracies, and destabilize authority. The reliance on imported grain also tied Rome's fate to distant provinces. Egypt, in particular, became indispensable. Whoever controlled the Nile's harvest controlled the stomach of Rome. This was why Augustus had forbidden senators from entering Egypt without imperial permission. Its grain was too central, too dangerous to be left in the hands of rivals. The politics of empire, then, was intertwined with the politics of agriculture, stretching from fields in the Nile Delta to the bakeries of the Subura. Hunger was also a weapon in Rome's foreign policy and military campaigns. Armies were fed on grain rations, carefully measured and transported. Cities under siege were starved into submission, while enemies sought to disrupt Roman supply lines. Grain, like gold, became the currency of power, one that could be hoarded, withheld, or promised as reward. And yet, beneath this elaborate system, the basic reality remained stark. The empire's greatest city could not feed itself. Its wealth, its art, its politics, all depended on the steady arrival of harvests grown far away. Any disruption, drought in Egypt, piracy in the Mediterranean, political unrest in Africa, rippled instantly through the capital. Hunger in Rome was not an occasional disaster, but an ever-present threat, a shadow behind the grandeur of marble temples and triumphal arches. Religion, too, acknowledged this fragile dependence. Grain was sacred to Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, whose temples in Rome served not only as places of worship but as repositories of records and laws concerning the food supply. Festivals honored her role in sustaining life, echoing the older Greek traditions of Demeter. The state cult of the annona personified the grain supply itself, elevating it to divine status, a recognition of its centrality to Roman existence. Even at the height of its empire, Rome's eternal appetite was never satisfied. The city grew faster than its food systems could comfortably sustain. Population pressures meant that even with imports, many lived precariously, their lives measured in loaves of bread distributed by the state. Archaeological evidence from urban housing shows cramped, poor-quality dwellings for the masses, their reliance on state grain a daily reminder of vulnerability. The phrase bread and circuses has often been used dismissively, as though the Roman people were easily distracted. But beneath it lay a deeper truth. The empire's durability required feeding its population, for without bread there could be no order, no politics, no empire. The circuses may have entertained, but it was the bread that sustained the experiment of Roman rule. Rome's appetite, eternal in name and nature, was also its weakness. In times of plenty, the Annona secured loyalty. In times of disruption, it threatened collapse. Hunger haunted the empire, a quiet adversary more insistent than barbarian invasions or senatorial intrigues. The endless hunger that devoured kingdoms now resided at the heart of the greatest empire the world had yet seen, reminding even emperors that their power, for all its ceremony, was no stronger than the next harvest of wheat across the sea. By the 6th century of the Common Era, Rome had fallen in the West, but its memory, its institutions, and much of its infrastructure survived in the East. The Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, carried forward the imperial mantle. Its capital was a city of immense wealth, guarded by mighty walls, supplied by the granaries of Egypt and the Black Sea, and enriched by trade that flowed from Asia, Africa, and Europe. Yet even this empire, fortified, sophisticated, and resilient, was not beyond the reach of hunger. In the mid-6th century, disease and famine converged in a slow catastrophe that scarred Byzantium for generations. This disaster is remembered today as the Justinianic Plague, named after the Emperor Justinian I, who ruled from 527 to 565. The plague was caused by Yersinia pestis, the same bacterium that centuries later would bring the Black Death to medieval Europe. It first arrived in Constantinople around 541 CE, carried, it seems, by rats and fleas traveling on grain shipments from Egypt. Here the empire's reliance on imported food, so similar to Rome before it, became a channel for its undoing. Ships bringing sustenance also brought infection. The accounts of contemporaries described the sudden arrival of the disease with grim clarity. Procopius, the court historian, wrote of how it spread invisibly at first, then struck with terrifying speed. People developed swellings in their groins or armpits, fevers, delirium, and within days were dead. Corpses piled in the streets of Constantinople, burial grounds overflowed, carts carried away bodies in endless procession. The city, once a hive of commerce and life, became silent. Its marketplaces emptied, its granaries unguarded, its streets echoing with the absence of footsteps. But the plague was not only a medical disaster, it carried with it profound consequences for food and survival. The disease killed workers in the fields, farmers who sowed and harvested, laborers who maintained the aqueducts and granaries. With each death, the chain of food production and distribution frayed. Crops rotted unharvested, livestock went untended, and shipments failed to arrive. Grain supplies dwindled, and the empire, though wealthy in land and resources, felt hunger gnaw at its core. The famine that followed was not the sudden emptiness of one year's bad harvest, but a creeping insufficiency. Survivors, fewer in number, found themselves unable to sustain the vast infrastructure of the empire. Irrigation canals in Egypt, once carefully managed to maximize the Nile's bounty, fell into disrepair as their caretakers died. In Anatolia, herds diminished as disease and neglect spread. In the Balkans and Syria, cities shrank, their populations too weakened to farm or trade. The combination of plague and famine devastated the economy. Tax revenues, the lifeblood of imperial administration, collapsed. Justinian's ambitious campaigns, wars to reclaim Italy from the Ostrogoths, North Africa from the Vandals, and parts of Spain from the Visigoths, faltered under the weight of depopulation. Soldiers could not be fed, supply lines broke down, and the treasury, starved of resources, teetered on the brink of exhaustion. The dream of restoring Rome's old grandeur was undermined not only by enemy armies, but by empty tables at home. Archaeological evidence supports these written accounts. In many regions of the Byzantine world, settlement patterns shifted in the mid-6th century. Towns shrank or were abandoned, trade networks contracted, and coin circulation declined. Signs of malnutrition appear in skeletal remains from this period. The plague may have recurred in waves for nearly 2 centuries, each outbreak accompanied by fresh labor shortages, new famines, and further decline. Hunger, in this context, was both symptom and amplifier. The plague struck hardest at already vulnerable populations, and in turn, the hunger it caused weakened survivors, making them more susceptible to infection. Malnourished bodies fought disease poorly. The cycle of death and want reinforced itself, leaving deep scars on the social fabric. Families dissolved as members perished. Fields were left fallow, villages dispersed. Religion absorbed and refracted these experiences. In the Christian Empire, famine and plague were often interpreted as divine punishment. Sermons and chronicles speak of God's wrath, of sin demanding atonement, of prayers and processions intended to ward off further disaster. Churches distributed what food they could, monasteries sheltered the hungry, and saints' cults spread as people sought intercession. Yet even the most pious found little relief. Hunger was not easily answered by prayer. The psychological toll was immense. Survivors lived in a landscape of absence. Absent neighbors, absent harvests, absent markets. Constantinople, once the jewel of the empire, was described by observers as half-empty, its population reduced by perhaps a third or more. The silence of hunger lay heavy on the city, a reminder that empire, no matter how powerful, could be humbled by forces invisible and inexorable. The consequences extended beyond Byzantium itself. The weakening of the empire created opportunities for its rivals. In Italy, the Gothic wars dragged on without decisive resolution, devastating the peninsula but leaving the Byzantines unable to fully re-establish control. In the east, the Persian Sasanian Empire pressed its advantage, raiding weakened provinces. Later, the rise of Islam in the 7th century would encounter a Byzantine state still recovering from the demographic and economic collapse of the plague years. Hunger and disease had softened the ground upon which new powers would grow. Modern historians debate the scale of the Justinianic plague. Some argue that its mortality, though high, has been exaggerated in older accounts. Others point to genetic and archaeological evidence that suggests profound demographic shifts. Yet whether it killed tens of millions or somewhat fewer, its impact on food supply and daily life is unmistakable. Hunger was not an afterthought but a central part of the catastrophe. Disease killed suddenly, but famine lingered, reshaping communities and economies for generations. In the end, the story of the Justinianic plague is not simply one of death, but of the hunger that followed in its wake. Empty tables, silent markets, fallow fields, these became the markers of a world in decline. The Byzantine Empire survived, but it was never quite the same. Its population thinned, its economy contracted, and its ambitions narrowed. The endless hunger that had devoured kingdoms before now gnawed at the empire of Constantinople, proving once again that even the most enduring states were vulnerable to the twin forces of famine and disease. To the south and east of Byzantium's shrinking world lay a subcontinent whose rhythms were set not by the flooding of a single river, nor by the flow of Mediterranean trade, but by the vast breath of the monsoon. In India, hunger wore a different face. It was not the erratic overflow of the Nile, or the Tigris, nor the dependency of Rome upon distant fields, but the seasonal arrival, or absence of rains. Here, famine was bound to the sky itself, to the clouds that gathered each summer, rolled in from the Indian Ocean, and broke open upon the land. When they came in abundance, fields turned emerald with rice and millet, wheat and barley, pulses and sugarcane. When they faltered, the earth cracked, rivers shrank, and granaries emptied. The medieval period in India, stretching loosely from the decline of the Gupta Empire in the 6th century to the rise of the Delhi Sultanate, and later the Mughal Empire, was an age of kingdoms, dynasties, and shifting sovereignties. The subcontinent was divided into regions with distinct climates and crops, each vulnerable in its own way to the rhythm of the monsoon. In the Deccan Plateau, drought was a recurring threat. In the Gangetic Plain, floods could wash away entire harvests. The coastal regions prospered when rains were kind, their ports humming with trade across the Arabian Sea and Bay of Bengal. But even there, a weak monsoon meant higher prices, thinner meals, and unrest. Famine in India was rarely a sudden isolated event. More often, it was cyclical, repeating across generations, remembered in chronicles, poetry, and inscription. The Sanskrit term durviksha, literally bad harvest, appears often in medieval texts, a reminder of how familiar scarcity had become. Inscriptions from the Chola, Rashtrakuta, and later Delhi Sultanate dynasties mention famine relief, the remission of taxes, or grants of land to temples and monasteries tasked with feeding the hungry. Hunger was woven into governance, a challenge that each new ruler had to address if they wished to sustain legitimacy. Temples and religious institutions often became central to famine response. Endowed with lands, they collected produce from tenants and stored grain in their own granaries. When shortages struck, these reserves could be distributed to the needy, both an act of piety and a display of the institution's social importance. Buddhism, Hinduism, and later Islam all offered charitable frameworks through which rulers and elites sought to alleviate suffering. The donation of food was not merely practical, but spiritual, a means of accruing merit or divine favor. Yet, despite these efforts, relief was always partial, never sufficient to meet the sheer scale of need. The connection between famine and empire building was especially visible in the medieval period. Armies required provisions, and campaigns were often launched only after the harvest. When drought or flood diminished yields, rulers struggled to maintain their forces. Conversely, ambitious projects of conquest and temple building placed heavy tax burdens on peasants, leaving them vulnerable when rains failed. A cycle thus emerged. Famine weakened kingdoms, opening them to invasion, while conquest and taxation deepened vulnerability to the next famine. One of the earliest recorded medieval famines struck during the reign of the Rashtrakutas in the 9th century, with chroniclers noting widespread starvation across the Deccan. Later, during the Delhi Sultanate, multiple severe famines were recorded, often tied to weak monsoons. The famine of 1335, under Muhammad bin Tughlaq, was particularly notorious, lasting several years and devastating wide swaths of the empire. Contemporary sources describe villages emptied, corpses lining roads, and prices for grain rising beyond reach. The empire, already strained by rebellion and overextension, staggered under the combined weight of hunger and political instability. The Mughal Empire, which rose in the 16th century, inherited both the wealth and the fragility of the monsoon system. Abul Fals, court historian of Akbar, wrote extensively about agriculture in the Ain-i-Akbari, noting the dependence of crops on timely rains. Famines struck repeatedly, some regional, others more widespread. In 1630-32, a famine in the Deccan and Gujarat caused immense suffering, compounded by plague. Accounts speak of families selling children, villages depopulated, and desperate survivors consuming leaves and carrion. The Mughal state organized relief, opening imperial granaries and suspending taxes, yet even its vast resources could not erase the impact of several consecutive monsoon failures. Unlike the Nile or the Euphrates, whose floods could be measured and managed, the monsoon remained elusive. Its patterns were only dimly understood, its failures unpredictable. Farmers relied on rituals and offerings to appease gods and goddesses associated with rain. Indra, the Vedic deity of storms, Varuna, lord of the waters, and countless local spirits honored at village shrines. Yet the monsoon remained beyond control. Its absence was interpreted as divine displeasure, a cosmic imbalance that rulers sought to redress through piety, processions, or reforms. Hunger was therefore not just ecological but also spiritual, embedded in a worldview that saw agriculture as a gift precariously maintained through divine favor. Trade provided some relief in certain regions. Ports along the western coast, from Calicut to Cambay, could import grain when local harvests failed. Merchants profited from scarcity, moving food along caravan routes or by sea. Yet transport was slow and costly, and the poorest were often left behind. For them, famine meant not only lack of food but the breakdown of community. Migration was common, with families abandoning parched villages for towns where charity might be found. Those who survived carried with them the memory of hunger, embedding it into oral traditions, songs and stories that echoed across centuries. Historians today trace these famines not only in chronicles but in the archaeological record. Layers of abandoned fields, shifts in settlement patterns, declines in urban activity. They find confirmation too, in the scars left on human remains, malnutrition evident in bones, shortened lifespans, signs of stress carried in the body itself. Hunger, in medieval India, was not merely an episode but a rhythm, recurring with the monsoon's failures, leaving deep marks on society, politics and even the landscape. Thus, the monsoon kingdoms lived in constant negotiation with the sky. Their wealth and splendor, of Chola temples, Delhi palaces, Mughal courts, stood always in the shadow of hunger. The endless hunger that devoured kingdoms whispered through parched fields and empty wells, reminding rulers and peasants alike that their fate was bound to clouds drifting across an ocean, sometimes generous, sometimes withholding, always beyond their command. The early 14th century in Europe seemed, at first, like a continuation of steady growth. Fields had been cleared across forests, populations had swelled, villages clustered near rivers and roads, and cathedrals rose in stone above market squares. But prosperity was delicate, built upon fragile balances of weather, soil, and yield. In the year 1315, that balance gave way, and with it began one of the most harrowing episodes of scarcity the continent had yet endured, the Great Famine. It began not with fire or sword, but with rain. Heavy, unrelenting rain fell across northern Europe in the spring and summer of 1315. The downpours turned fields into shallow lakes, washed away seed, and drowned pastures. Hay rotted in stacks, fodder vanished, and livestock weakened without feed. By autumn, the sodden fields yielded little. The harvest failed, and the surplus that communities relied upon was not to be found. Hunger began quietly, first as higher prices in the market, then as thin meals in cottages, and finally as gnawing emptiness spreading from one household to another. The rains did not relent. In 1316, the clouds gathered again, and Europe endured another summer of sodden fields. The soil, waterlogged from the year before, yielded even less. Grain, the foundation of medieval diets, became scarce. Wheat and rye, oats and barley, all grew poorly, if at all. Villagers gathered what they could, but stores dwindled. Cattle, unable to graze properly, died in large numbers, depriving households not only of meat and milk, but of the animals needed to plough fields for the next season. Starvation began to carve its mark more deeply. Chroniclers of the age left behind descriptions that drift between observation and lament. They wrote of skeletal figures roaming roadsides, of children abandoned, of families consuming bark, roots or carrion. Accounts even mentioned darker rumors of cannibalism in isolated places, though whether these were exaggerations or grim reality remains uncertain. Yet, the mere presence of such claims reveals the scale of desperation. Urban centers, which had grown rapidly in previous decades, became particularly vulnerable. Cities depended on steady supplies from surrounding countryside. When those flows shrank, markets emptied, and bread became scarce. Prices soared, wages did not. The poor suffered most, their hunger stark against the relative survival of wealthier households that could hoard or import grain. Unrest simmered, though the rains and hunger sapped the strength for rebellion. Instead, famine expressed itself in quiet collapse, abandoned villages, silent workshops, empty roads. The famine lasted not a single year, but three. 1315 through 1317 saw consecutive failures of harvest, relentless rains and waning reserves. Populations weakened by hunger became more vulnerable to disease. Typhoid, dysentery, and other illnesses spread easily through undernourished communities. Mortality rose steadily. Some estimates suggest that between 10 and 15% of Europe's population perished, though exact numbers remain beyond certainty. The famine did not kill as suddenly as plague would later do, but it hollowed out communities with equal inevitability. Rulers struggled to respond. Kings and lords could reduce taxes, attempt to import food, or distribute what reserves they held, but these efforts were piecemeal. England, France, the Low Countries, the German principalities, each faced the same relentless rains, the same scarcity. There was no distant region of abundance from which Europe might be rescued. Relief came only slowly and imperfectly, through sporadic trade or the redistribution of whatever meager surpluses could be secured. Religion framed much of how contemporaries understood the famine. Chroniclers interpreted the endless rain as divine displeasure, a punishment for sin, or an omen of worse to come. Penitential processions wound through villages and towns, as communities sought forgiveness, prayed for clear skies, and carried relics through muddy streets. Priests preached sermons of repentance, urging humility before God's wrath. Yet the rain continued, and the hunger deepened, offering little reassurance that prayers alone could bring reprieve. Social structures strained under the weight of scarcity. Serfs tied to their lords' lands could not easily escape hunger. Some fled regardless, leaving behind obligations in search of food. Others succumbed quietly, their deaths leaving fields untilled. Lords too suffered losses, without tenants, their wealth diminished. Monarchs faced unrest, weakened armies, and a growing sense that divine favor had turned against them. Hunger reshaped the balance between classes, exposing the fragility of medieval Europe's feudal order. In 1317, the rains finally eased, and the harvest that year showed signs of recovery. Yet famine lingered. Fields poorly sown and lacking livestock for ploughing yielded little. Communities still lacked reserves. It was not until 1318, and beyond, that recovery truly took hold, as drier seasons returned, and agriculture regained its rhythm. But the scars of famine did not vanish with the sun. Europe emerged smaller, weaker, and more cautious. The Great Famine had lasting consequences. Demographic decline slowed urban growth, and curtailed expansion into marginal lands. Social memory of hunger lingered in chronicles, sermons, and oral traditions, shaping attitudes toward risk, harvest, and divine providence. When the Black Death struck Europe 3 decades later, the continent was already marked by the memory of famine, its people sensitized to catastrophe, its systems fragile. Historians often view the Great Famine as the first of a sequence of crises that defined the later Middle Ages, a period of contraction after centuries of expansion. Where the 12th and 13th centuries had seen growth and prosperity, the 14th brought famine, plague, and war. Hunger in 1315, 1317 was the opening act, a grim foreshadowing of decades when survival itself would often seem precarious. Thus, the Great Famine reminds us of the profound dependence of medieval society upon the weather. Fields, harvests, and grain supplies underpinned everything: politics, economy, daily life. When the rains turned relentless, the entire system faltered. Kingdoms, villages, cities, and households alike discovered that no wealth, no privilege, and no piety could insulate them completely from the simple fact of an empty harvest. And so hunger, once again, quietly devoured kingdoms, not with sword or fire, but with damp air, failed crops, and thin, joyless bread. The Great Famine had already weakened the foundations of medieval Europe. By the middle of the 14th century, fields had recovered somewhat, but populations remained fragile, harvests uncertain, and the memory of hunger not far behind. Then, as if famine had been only a prelude, another shadow fell across the continent, darker, swifter, and far more devastating. This was the Black Death, the plague that swept through Europe from 1347 onward, carrying away millions, reshaping society, and leaving in its wake an eerie paradox: abundance of food in a world of death. The origins of the plague lay far beyond Europe. Historians trace its movement along trade routes from Central Asia, across the steppes and the Silk Road, into the ports of the Black Sea, and finally carried by ships into the Mediterranean. In 1347, Genoese merchants fleeing the Mongol siege of Kaffa brought with them not only goods, but rats and fleas infected with Yersinia pestis. From Messina in Sicily, the disease spread rapidly through Italy, France, Spain, and beyond, following the arteries of trade and pilgrimage. By 1348, northern Europe was infected, and by 1350, nearly the whole continent was consumed by plague. Mortality was staggering. Modern estimates suggest that between 30 and 60% of Europe's population perished within a few short years. Towns lost half their residents, villages disappeared entirely, monasteries, once stable centers of prayer and charity, fell silent as communities of monks were decimated. Chroniclers wrote of carts filled with bodies, of graves dug hastily, of priests too fearful to administer last rites. The silence of famine was replaced by the suddenness of plague, but the result was the same, a continent hollowed out. Yet famine and plague were not entirely separate stories. Hunger had already weakened many, lowering resistance to disease. Malnourished populations, their bodies frail from years of thin diets, succumbed more readily to infection. The Black Death therefore struck harder where famine had recently lingered, compounding the toll. Death and hunger formed a cruel partnership, one striking the body through emptiness, the other through contagion. Together they reshaped Europe at a pace few could comprehend. Paradoxically, as the plague emptied villages and cities, fields were left untended, yet the sudden reduction of population meant that food became more abundant for the survivors. With fewer mouths to feed, stores of grain lasted longer. Livestock wandered freely in some regions, no longer tethered to the constant demands of hungry households. Chroniclers describe the strange reality of once starving communities now surrounded by plenty, though haunted by the memory of those no longer alive to share in it. Bread was easier to come by, meat less rare, but the joy of sustenance was muted by grief and the absence of family. This paradox had profound social consequences. Labor shortages meant that surviving peasants could demand better terms from their lords. Serfdom, already under strain, began to unravel in many places. Wages rose, sometimes dramatically, as the scarcity of workers forced concessions. Lords, accustomed to abundance of labor and obedience, now faced negotiations, resistance and flight. In some regions, peasants abandoned marginal lands altogether, retreating to more fertile areas, where their labor yielded greater returns. Fields on hillsides, or in poor soils, were left to forest and scrub, shrinking the cultivated landscape, but improving its overall productivity. The abundance of food and shortage of labor shifted diets as well. Meat, once a rarity for the poorest, became more accessible. Dairy, fish, and grain-based meals grew more varied, as survivors found themselves in possession of lands, animals, or stores left by the dead. Nutrition improved for many, at least temporarily, even as the continent mourned. It was a strange contradiction: fuller tables set in emptier homes, abundance made possible by absence. The plague also reshaped how famine itself was understood. In earlier times, hunger was seen as the inevitable companion of bad harvests, a divine punishment, or a natural cycle. But the sudden abundance after plague deaths revealed hunger's deeper connection to population pressure. Too many people for too little land had left Europe vulnerable. Too few people for the same land left food more plentiful. In this sense, famine and plague became entwined in historical memory, each explaining the other. Some saw the Black Death as divine correction for the overabundance of people, an awful rebalancing of soil and population. Governments and churches faced immense challenges. Relief during famine had meant opening granaries, remitting taxes, or organizing almsgiving. But plague was different. It required care for the dying, disposal of the dead, and attempts, often futile, to stop the spread. Cities enacted quarantines, restricted movement, and sought to cleanse the air through fires or processions. Priests and monks offered prayers, but their numbers fell swiftly. Relief for hunger became less urgent when food was suddenly plentiful, yet the machinery of social order itself seemed to falter under the weight of mortality. In the countryside, abandoned villages became haunting markers of the plague's impact. Roofs collapsed, fields grew wild, churches stood empty. Survivors sometimes moved into these deserted spaces, repopulating them in later decades, but often they were left to decay. Archaeological traces today reveal whole settlements vanished in the mid-14th century, erased by the twin forces of famine and plague. The psychological impact was equally lasting. Hunger had taught generations to fear empty granaries, now plague taught them to fear sudden uncontrollable death. Together they produced a worldview steeped in mortality, humility, and uncertainty. Art reflected this in macabre imagery: skeletons dancing, death leading processions, grim reminders that plenty could turn to nothing, and life to death without warning. By the late 14th century, Europe began to recover. Populations slowly rose again, fields were worked more fully, and new social arrangements emerged. The memory of famine and plague, however, lingered for centuries. They had revealed the fragility of human life before forces beyond control, whether rain that refused to cease or disease that leapt invisibly from body to body. They had also shown how hunger and death could paradoxically create abundance, reshaping economies and societies in ways no ruler had planned. Thus, the Black Death and the famine that preceded it stand together as twin shadows of the Middle Ages. One hollowed bellies, the other emptied lungs, one whispered through thin harvests, the other struck with fever and swellings. Yet both left the same legacy: a transformed Europe, fields greener yet emptier, tables fuller yet lonelier, kingdoms altered by absence more than by abundance. In that paradox lay one of history's most enduring truths, that hunger and death, whether together or apart, quietly devoured the order of things, leaving survivors to piece together a new world from the silence left behind. The 17th century in Europe unfolded under the sign of conflict. It was an age marked not by a single war, but by many: wars of religion, dynastic struggles, and territorial disputes. Of these, the 30 Years' War stands most prominent, stretching from 1618 to 1648, entangling much of the continent in devastation. Yet behind the thunder of cannon and the clash of armies lurked a quieter force that gnawed at the bones of Europe with greater persistence: hunger. This century was often described by later historians as a general crisis. Across Europe, climates cooled in what is now called the Little Ice Age. Summers were shorter, winters harsher, and growing seasons less predictable. The rains could arrive at the wrong time, or frost linger too long in the spring. Harvests faltered not just in one region, but across broad swaths of the continent. Grain, wheat in the south, rye and barley in the north, yielded inconsistently, leaving communities perpetually uncertain whether the next season would bring sufficiency or scarcity. The 30 Years' War worsened this uncertainty to an unbearable degree. Armies numbering in the tens of thousands marched across the German lands, consuming whatever food lay in their path. Soldiers foraged ruthlessly, seizing grain, slaughtering livestock, and stripping villages bare. For peasants already struggling under poor harvests, this meant ruin. Hunger became not only a natural consequence of weather, but a deliberate weapon of war. Fields were burned, mills destroyed, and granaries plundered. The chronicles of the time are filled with descriptions of misery. Villagers, already reduced to eating acorns or nettles, found themselves faced with the advance of mercenary troops demanding supplies. Refusal was impossible, compliance equally ruinous. Those who fled into forests often perished of exposure or hunger. Those who remained saw their crops taken, and their children conscripted or worse. Starvation hollowed communities from within, while war pressed upon them from without. In Germany, the devastation was profound. Some regions lost up to a third of their population, not only from battle but from famine and disease. Famine weakened resistance to plague outbreaks, which flared repeatedly in besieged or overcrowded towns. Whole provinces became wastelands, with once cultivated fields reverting to scrub as peasants abandoned them. Travelers wrote of villages with no inhabitants, only ruined houses and overgrown paths. The silence of absence spoke louder than the noise of cannon. The suffering was not confined to the German lands. France endured its own famines in the 17th century, particularly during the 1690s, when poor harvests combined with Louis XIV's wars to devastate the countryside. Scotland suffered the 7 ill years between 1695 and 1702, when repeated crop failures led to widespread starvation and emigration. Sweden, Denmark, and other northern kingdoms also saw populations thinned by hunger during this century of climatic difficulty. Everywhere, the same patterns repeated: thin harvests, higher prices, war levies, and the collapse of subsistence into desperation. Religion colored how famine was understood. The 30 Years' War had begun as a conflict between Catholic and Protestant states, and each side framed hunger as evidence of divine judgment upon the other. Preachers thundered that failed harvests revealed God's displeasure at heresy or sin. Penitential processions, prayers for rain or for dry skies, and days of fasting were proclaimed. Yet, the hunger persisted, untroubled by human attempts at interpretation. It was not so much the punishment of one creed or another, but the shared vulnerability of all. Governments attempted relief with varying success. Grain was sometimes imported by river or sea, but distribution was limited, and corruption rife. Price controls occasionally were enacted, but often ignored by desperate merchants. Charity from monasteries, churches and wealthy individuals provided some relief, but famine was too widespread, too relentless for such efforts to suffice. In many cases, the state itself became complicit in deepening hunger, as taxes were levied even in times of scarcity to fund the machinery of war. The psychological impact of famine during this century was immense. The Great Famine of 1315, 1317 and the Black Death had already etched hunger and mortality into European memory, but the 17th century seemed to replay these catastrophes on a stage larger and longer. Entire generations grew up under the expectation of scarcity. Parents warned children of the fragility of plenty, villagers told stories of winters without bread, and families remembered the thin soups of years when little else could be found. Hunger became not just a physical condition but a cultural inheritance, a memory passed down. Paradoxically, as in earlier centuries, famine sometimes produced social changes. Labor shortages after catastrophic years allowed peasants to renegotiate terms or migrate to less war-torn regions. In some cases, abandoned land could be claimed by survivors, offering a strange kind of opportunity amid the ruins. Yet these gains were unstable, threatened by the return of armies or the arrival of the next failed harvest. No stability could last long in a century so unsettled. The hungry century of wars is often overshadowed in historical memory by the singular drama of the Black Death or the spectacle of later revolutions, yet its impact was no less profound. Population growth stagnated, agriculture faltered, economies weakened and trust in institutions eroded. The 17th century revealed the vulnerability of early modern states not only to cannon fire, but to the quiet devastation of hunger. Armies could sack cities, but it was famine that hollowed kingdoms, leaving them brittle, weary and diminished. When peace finally returned to the German lands with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, it was a peace made not in strength, but in exhaustion. The land itself bore the scars of hunger, villages depopulated, fields overgrown and granaries empty. The survivors, fewer in number, resumed the cycle of ploughing, sowing and harvesting, as they had always done, but the memory of hunger lingered. In France and Britain, in Scandinavia and the Low Countries, the century closed with more famines still, each leaving its own mark upon the populations that endured them. Thus, the 17th century stands as a reminder that history is not only shaped by generals and kings, but by the endless hunger that threads itself through war and peace alike. It was a century when famine overlapped with battles, when fields yielded to armies as much as to weather, and when kingdoms discovered that the true enemy was often not the rival across the field, but the empty field itself. When the word famine and island are placed together, most minds drift immediately to the 19th century, to the blighted potato fields of the 1840s and the haunting exodus that followed. Yet hunger had long stalked the island, centuries before the arrival of the potato, shaping the medieval and early modern history of Ireland in quieter but no less devastating ways. To understand how deeply famine shaped Irish society, one must step back into the centuries when barley, oats and wheat formed the staples, when herds of cattle wandered the wet pastures, and when scarcity was already a recurring visitor long before potatoes took root in Irish soil. The Irish landscape, beautiful in its rolling hills, boglands and rugged coasts, carried both abundance and fragility. Rain fell often, ensuring green fields and meadows, but excessive moisture and poor drainage made agriculture precarious. The soil was patchy, fertile in some areas, shallow or stony in others. Crops could thrive in a good year, but they could just as easily fail under the weight of too much rain or an untimely frost. Medieval Irish society leaned heavily on cattle as a measure of wealth and status, but herds were equally vulnerable to disease, theft, or the simple problem of insufficient fodder in harsh winters. When crops failed, hunger followed swiftly, particularly for those with fewer herds to cushion the blow. The early medieval annals of Ireland, those monkish records kept in monasteries across the island, are dotted with references to famine. Sparse lines describe years when hunger afflicted the people, often linked with harsh winters or failed harvests. In 1114, for example, the Annals of the Four Masters recorded a famine so severe that innumerable multitudes perished of hunger. Earlier entries describe famines accompanying Viking raids or local wars, when stored grain was seized or burned. These annals rarely linger on detail, but their frequency reminds us that famine was not an anomaly, but a familiar rhythm of medieval Irish life. As in much of Europe, war and hunger are often intertwined. Ireland's political landscape was fragmented into rival kingdoms, each ruled by dynastic families competing for dominance. Raids were common, cattle were seized, granaries plundered. Warfare rarely brought decisive conquest, but it did bring instability, and with instability came hunger. Peasants, caught between rival lords, often suffered the most, as their crops and herds were consumed by armies. Monasteries too, though sometimes centers of charity, could not always protect their dependents when their own stores were pillaged. Famines were not always tied to conflict. Weather played its own merciless role. The late 13th and early 14th centuries, coinciding with the onset of the Little Ice Age, brought colder, wetter conditions across Europe. Ireland was not spared. The Great European Famine of 1315-1317 swept across the island as well. Chroniclers describe excessive rains, rotting crops and starvation. The famine coincided with the Bruce invasion of Ireland, led by Edward Bruce, brother of Robert the Bruce of Scotland. His campaign against Anglo-Norman lords in Ireland worsened the already dire situation, as armies consumed supplies and laid waste to lands. Hunger, plague and war combined to leave much of Ireland in misery. Edward Bruce himself perished in battle in 1318, but the scars of those years lingered in depopulated regions and memories of loss. The early modern period brought further hardship. Ireland's integration into wider European politics, especially through English conquest and colonization, created new pressures. Wars of the Tudor and Stuart periods, from the late 16th to the mid-17th century, repeatedly devastated the land. Armies moved through the countryside, burning crops to deny sustenance to their enemies, slaughtering cattle, and seizing grain. The 9 Years' War, 1594-1603, fought between Irish lords and English forces, culminated in widespread famine. Accounts describe tens of thousands starving, people reduced to eating horseflesh, herbs, and even the bark of trees. The devastation was compounded by outbreaks of plague, which found fertile ground among weakened populations. One of the most notorious famines before the potato occurred during the Cromwellian conquest of Ireland in the 1640s. Oliver Cromwell's campaign was brutal, marked by siege, massacre, and scorched earth tactics. Crops were systematically destroyed, livestock driven off, and food supplies denied to Irish rebels and civilians alike. The result was famine on a scale that some contemporaries compared to biblical disasters. Contemporary sources estimated that a significant portion of the Irish population perished in those years, whether by starvation, disease or violence. Entire regions were left depopulated, and survivors displaced, forced into exile, or reduced to servitude. Even in years of relative peace, hunger was never far. The reliance on grain and cattle meant vulnerability to both weather and disease. Grain harvests could fail with excessive rain or cold, while herds could be decimated by outbreaks of murrain or other livestock diseases. The poor, lacking reserves or large herds, suffered most, their diets reduced to thin gruel or foraged greens. Famines became etched into folk memory, preserved in ballads, laments and oral traditions. Hunger was not only a physical trial but a cultural presence, shaping how communities saw their relationship to land, lordship, and fate. The absence of the potato in these centuries is striking in retrospect. Introduced to Europe from the Americas in the late 16th century, the potato only gradually made its way into Irish fields. Before its adoption, Ireland's population was smaller, and its agricultural base narrower, leaving it more vulnerable to scarcity. Once potatoes were widely cultivated in the 17th and 18th centuries, they would sustain a population boom and ultimately set the stage for the catastrophic famine of the 1840s. But long before that disaster, Ireland had already endured cycles of hunger, etched into its annals and its soil. These pre-potato famines reveal an Ireland perpetually vulnerable, not yet defined by a single crop, but already marked by the endless hunger that devoured kingdoms and communities alike. They remind us that famine was not an invention of the 19th century, nor confined to one tragic decade, but a recurring rhythm of Irish history stretching back through medieval and early modern centuries. Thus, when the Great Famine of the 1840s arrived, it did not strike an island unfamiliar with hunger. Rather, it revived memories as old as the annals, familiar patterns of scarcity and suffering, amplified by the scale of dependence on the potato. The history of famine in Ireland is therefore not a single story but a long continuum, of which the pre-potato centuries formed the grim foundation. In the humid lowlands of Bengal, where the Ganges, Brahmaputra and Meghna rivers wound their endless paths across fertile plains, famine seemed at first almost unimaginable. The land was among the richest in the world, its soil nourished by seasonal floods, its fields heavy with rice, pulses and cash crops that had for centuries sustained dense populations. Traders from across Asia, and later from Europe, had long recognized Bengal as a jewel, abundant in grain, textiles, and the intricate wealth of riverine commerce. Yet in 1770, in one of the cruelest convergences of nature and misrule, this fertile region became the stage for one of the deadliest famines in recorded history, claiming perhaps 10 million lives, nearly a third of Bengal's population at the time. The origins of this catastrophe lay in a pattern that had repeated itself for centuries: the fragile dependence of agrarian societies on the rhythm of monsoon rains. The late 1760s brought irregular monsoons and drought conditions across parts of eastern India. Crops withered, ponds dried, and wells fell silent. Yet in many societies, scarcity might have been mitigated by reserves, by communal relief, or by rulers who recognized their duty to sustain their subjects. Bengal in 1770, however, was under the newly entrenched rule of the British East India Company, which had secured the right to collect revenue from Bengal after its victory at the Battle of Plassey in 1757, and further at Buxar in 1764. The company was not a traditional kingdom, but a commercial enterprise. Its primary goal was profit, measured in the steady flow of revenue and exportable goods to Britain. Land revenue demands were fixed and inflexible, and collectors pressed for payment, even when harvests failed. For the company's officials and its shareholders in London, grain was not first and foremost sustenance but a commodity, to be taxed, bought, sold, and shipped. In years of scarcity, this attitude transformed vulnerability into disaster. By the winter of 1769-1770, the warning signs were clear. Reports of poor harvest spread, and the rural poor began to migrate in search of food. Livestock perished as fodder grew scarce, further undermining agricultural resilience. Grain prices rose sharply, but the company's revenue demands did not ease. Zamindars and local officials, pressed to meet quotas, extracted what they could from tenants, leaving villages bare. Grain merchants, sensing profit, hoarded supplies to sell at higher prices. For the poor, there was no margin. Hunger deepened into starvation. The famine was not confined to isolated villages, but spread across Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa, regions tied together by rivers and trade. The sheer scale was visible in the emptying of towns, as starving people staggered toward imagined centers of relief. Roads became littered with bodies. Contemporary observers wrote of entire villages deserted, fields untilled, the air heavy with decay. British officials recorded these scenes in dispatches, though their accounts were often couched in detached language, statistics and reports that masked the enormity of human suffering. Mortality soared through 1770, Starvation was the primary killer, but it was compounded by disease. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, and epidemics of smallpox and cholera followed the movements of desperate populations. Some estimates place the death toll at 10 million, though numbers can never be exact. What is certain is that a massive portion of Bengal's population perished within a year. The famine emptied villages, depopulated districts, and left fields uncultivated for seasons afterward. The company's response was strikingly inadequate. Grain relief was minimal, often restricted to those who could pay, or to urban centers where company officials resided. There were isolated efforts by individual administrators, some of whom established soup kitchens or distributed grain, but there was no coordinated or large-scale relief effort. In fact, the famine became perversely profitable for certain company agents and private traders, who sold hoarded grain at inflated prices. While the population starved, the company's revenue collection for the year declined only slightly, a testament to the relentless extraction that continued even amid disaster. The famine left scars deeper than mortality alone. It weakened the fabric of rural society. With so many laborers dead, cultivation fell into decline in subsequent years, and revenue shortfalls grew. Villages once teeming with life became overgrown, their homes collapsed, their fields untended. In a society already strained by colonial rule, trust in rulers, whether zamindars, company officials or local elites, eroded further. Hunger had not only killed, it had dismantled the structures that sustained life. For the East India Company, the famine became a moment of both embarrassment and reinforcement of control. In Britain, news of the catastrophe filtered slowly, softened by official reports but still alarming in its scale. Critics of the company seized on the famine as evidence of misrule, pointing to the dangers of a trading corporation exercising sovereign power. In Bengal, survivors had little recourse, but the demographic collapse created a landscape of weakened resistance, easier for the company to dominate. The famine, in a bitter paradox, cleared the way for more thorough consolidation of colonial authority. Later historians have debated the precise balance of natural disaster and human mismanagement in the famine of 1770. Drought was real, but scarcity need not have become mass death. For centuries, Indian rulers had occasionally provided famine relief, reducing taxes or distributing grain. What distinguished 1770 was the rigid revenue system, the priority given to profit over subsistence, and the indifference of a commercial empire that viewed its subjects not as people but as resources. In this sense, the Bengal famine foreshadowed later colonial famines, including the even more deadly disasters of the 19th century, when railroads and global markets would intertwine with scarcity to magnify hunger. The famine also shifted patterns of memory. For those who survived, it became a reference point, a marker of suffering that was remembered for generations. Oral traditions, folk songs and local histories kept alive the image of the famine as both natural calamity and colonial crime. In broader historiography, it remains a reminder that famines are rarely natural in their entirety. They are shaped by human decisions, by governance, by the priorities of those in power. Thus, the Bengal famine of 1770 stands as a turning point in the larger story of hunger that devoured kingdoms and empires. It showed how the convergence of weather and exploitation could transform one of the most fertile regions of the world into a graveyard, and how colonial misrule magnified human vulnerability into catastrophe. In its shadow, the later history of colonial India would unfold, haunted by the knowledge that famine was no longer an accident of nature, but a recurring feature of empire. Among the quiet revolutions that reshaped the daily rhythms of European life, few were as unassuming as the spread of the potato. It was not a grain, not a familiar cereal that could be milled into flour and baked into bread, but rather a starchy tuber pulled from beneath the soil. To medieval and early modern Europeans, it seemed strange, even faintly suspicious, a plant without a place in the established hierarchies of food and ritual. And yet, within a few centuries of its arrival from the Andes, the potato would transform Europe's relationship with hunger. It would rescue populations from the threat of famine in one century, only to entrap them in dependence and tragedy in another. The story of the potato began far from Europe. in the highlands of South America. There, in the Andes, indigenous peoples had domesticated the potato thousands of years before Europeans ever saw it. The tuber was resilient to cold, grew in poor soils, and could be stored for months if properly dried. In the Inca Empire, potatoes were a dietary cornerstone, and varieties were cultivated with remarkable diversity. Yet this agricultural treasure traveled to Europe only after the Spanish conquest of the Americas in the 16th century. Alongside maize, tomatoes, and cacao, the potato was one of the New World crops introduced to an Old World that was often reluctant to embrace it. The earliest records of potatoes in Europe appear in Spain in the late 1500s. From there they slowly spread to Italy, the Low Countries, and eventually to northern Europe. At first they were regarded as curiosities, sometimes grown in botanical gardens more than in fields, admired for their strange flowers. Suspicion was common. Some believed potatoes caused leprosy, others distrusted them because they were not mentioned in the Bible. In societies where bread was both food and symbol, the potato's underground growth and unbread-like form made it unfamiliar and unsettling. Acceptance was gradual, but hunger has a way of silencing suspicion. By the 17th century, famines still recurred regularly across Europe, particularly in regions where dependence on grain harvests left populations vulnerable to a single failed season. The potato, by contrast, grew beneath the soil, somewhat shielded from harsh weather and locust swarms. Its yields were higher per acre than wheat or rye, and it thrived even in marginal soils. Slowly its practical benefits outweighed cultural hesitation. In Ireland, the potato found especially fertile ground. Introduced in the late 16th or early 17th century, it became a staple by the 18th century. The tuber's caloric density meant that even small plots could sustain large families. For tenant farmers living under English landlords, with limited access to land, the potato offered survival. By the early 19th century, much of the rural population of Ireland depended on little more than potatoes and milk, a diet monotonous but sufficient for subsistence. Population growth followed, swelling beyond what earlier agricultural bases could have supported. Yet dependence would later turn deadly, when blight struck in the 1840s. Elsewhere in Europe, the potato became both supplement and safeguard. In Prussia, and much of Central Europe, rulers actively promoted potato cultivation. Frederick the Great of Prussia, in the 18th century, famously encouraged his subjects to plant potatoes, even resorting to trickery by having fields guarded to spark peasant curiosity and desire. In times of war, such as during the 7 Years' War, potatoes proved invaluable, as armies could not as easily seize or burn them as they could granaries of wheat. Tubers hidden beneath the soil became a secret reserve against plunder. By the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the potato had taken root in much of Europe. Its adoption coincided with rapid demographic expansion. Populations grew not only in Ireland but across France, the German states, and the Low Countries. Urbanization and industrialization, too, leaned on this new food security. Laborers in growing cities could depend on potatoes as an inexpensive and filling food, freeing grain supplies for bread and for commerce. In this way, the potato became not just a peasant crop but a foundation for Europe's shift into the modern age. Yet this same dependence carried hidden dangers. Unlike wheat or barley, where multiple varieties and regions diversified risk, the potato in Europe was often planted in limited genetic strains. This uniformity made it vulnerable to disease. In good years the yield seemed miraculous, but in bad years, catastrophe was inevitable. The Irish experience would demonstrate this vulnerability with tragic clarity, but the structural dependence was European-wide. The same qualities that made the potato a safeguard against famine also made it, in time, a single point of failure. Even before the Irish famine of the 1840s, smaller crises hinted at the dangers. In the late 18th century, crop failures across parts of Europe caused localized scarcities. The potato blight itself, caused by the pathogen Phytophthora infestans, would not strike until the 19th century, but diseases and poor harvests periodically reduced supplies, reminding populations of their precarious reliance. Still, the potato had become too deeply embedded to be abandoned. The cultural transformation of the potato was as significant as its agricultural one. In societies that had once mistrusted it, the tuber became central to cuisines and identities. In Ireland, it became synonymous with the rural poor, both sustenance and symbol. In Germany, potato dishes became staples of everyday cooking. In Eastern Europe, potatoes joined bread as a defining element of the peasant diet. Over time, the initial suspicion gave way to familiarity, and then to dependence, so that the potato, once foreign and distrusted, became as essential as any grain. The paradox of the potato was thus complete by the 19th century. It had rescued millions from hunger, sustained growing populations, and helped underpin the rise of industrial economies. Yet it had also concentrated vulnerability, tying entire regions to the fate of a single crop. When the blight arrived, particularly in Ireland, the results were catastrophic. Famine returned with renewed ferocity, reminding the world that no food, however abundant, could by itself guarantee security. The story of the potato, therefore, is not simply one of agricultural innovation, but of the endless hunger that stalked Europe. It was a story of survival, yes, but also of fragility, dependence, and the quiet dangers of abundance. A root crop had become bread, a substitute so complete that it reshaped societies, but in doing so, it made them vulnerable to a single failure. Hunger had been deferred, not defeated. By the mid-19th century, the Irish countryside seemed deceptively fertile, a green landscape quilted with fields and hedgerows, dotted with stone cottages and the smoke of turf fires. Beneath this appearance of abundance, however, lay fragility. A vast share of the population, particularly the rural poor, who made up the majority, depended almost entirely on the potato. The crop had allowed Ireland's population to grow rapidly, reaching over 8 million by the 1840s, a density greater than much of Europe at the time. For many families, a single acre of potatoes could feed 6 or more mouths. Yet this very reliance created a society precariously balanced upon the health of a single tuber. When the pathogen Phytophthora infestans reached Ireland in 1845, carried from the Americas, the balance collapsed. The blight spread rapidly in the damp climate, blackening leaves, rotting tubers in the soil, and leaving fields that had once promised plenty reduced to stinking ruin. The first year of blight was devastating, but it was only the beginning. Over the next several years, waves of crop failure would return, leaving millions without their primary source of nourishment. The impact was catastrophic. In a society where large landholdings were owned by Anglo-Irish landlords and worked by tenant farmers, the failure of potatoes meant not only hunger, but eviction. Tenants who could not pay rent were turned out of their cottages. Some landlords provided relief or reduced demands, but many enforced their rights with cold efficiency. Families crowded into workhouses, already overwhelmed, where disease spread easily. Others took to the roads, wandering in search of food, or gathered at ports in hopes of passage abroad. The British government, which administered Ireland as part of the United Kingdom, faced a crisis of unprecedented scale. Relief efforts were attempted, but they were guided as much by ideology as by necessity. In London, many policymakers adhered to the principles of laissez-faire economics, believing that markets should be allowed to regulate themselves, even in famine. Grain imports were limited by the Corn Laws until 1846, and even after their repeal, the government was reluctant to interfere heavily in trade. Ireland continued to export food, grain, livestock, butter, to Britain throughout the famine years, even as millions within Ireland starved. For those watching their children die in cottages or ditches, the sight of food leaving their shores was a bitter reminder that famine was not only natural disaster, but human decision. Soup kitchens and public works projects were established in some areas, but these measures were inconsistent and often temporary. By 1847, known as Black 47, the situation was at its worst. Starvation, malnutrition, and disease claimed lives in staggering numbers. Typhus, dysentery, and cholera swept through weakened communities. Contemporary accounts describe skeletal figures in rags, entire families dead in their cottages, and parish registers filled with the names of the lost. Estimates of mortality vary, but most scholars place the death toll at around 1 million people between 1845 and 1852. Yet death was only part of the story. Another 1 to 2 million people emigrated, many aboard overcrowded ships bound for North America or Britain. These coffin ships, as they came to be called, were notorious for their high mortality rates, with disease and malnutrition claiming lives even during the voyage. For those who survived, emigration meant severing ties with ancestral land, leaving behind villages hollowed by loss. Demographic transformation was permanent. Ireland's population fell from over 8 million in the 1840s to around 6 million a decade later, and it would never again return to its pre-famine numbers. Entire regions were depopulated, especially in the west and south. Gaelic-speaking communities shrank, as language and tradition eroded alongside population. The famine thus reshaped not only numbers but culture, leaving a scar in the very identity of Ireland. The political consequences were profound as well. For many Irish, the famine became a symbol of neglect and exploitation under British rule, to the belief that the government had failed to act decisively, or worse, had allowed exports and evictions to continue in the face of mass starvation, deepened resentment and fueled nationalist movements. Later generations would look back on the famine as both tragedy and political turning point, a moment when the relationship between Ireland and Britain was marked indelibly by suffering and mistrust. Memory of the famine travelled across oceans. Irish emigrants carried with them stories of hunger, exile and survival. In the United States, Canada, and Australia, Irish communities grew rapidly, shaping the demographics and politics of their new homes. The diaspora became one of the most enduring legacies of the famine, scattering Irish identity across the globe, bound together by the shared memory of catastrophe. The famine also became a reference point in the wider history of hunger. It revealed how vulnerability could be created not only by natural blight, but by political economy. Ireland had not lacked food in absolute terms. It had lacked access to food, export markets, property rights, and economic ideologies combined with crop failure to magnify a disaster into a cataclysm. Famines had long haunted history, but in the 19th century, they increasingly bore the mark of empire, ideology, and the modern state. In Irish collective memory, the Great Hunger has never faded. It lives on in literature, in folk memory, in monuments, and in the diaspora's identity. The famine is remembered not as an isolated event, but as part of the endless hunger that shaped nations, devoured communities, and reshaped empires. The quiet fields of Ireland, once thick with potato plants, became symbols of fragility, resilience, and loss. Thus, the Great Hunger of the 1840s stands not only as Ireland's darkest hour, but as a chapter in the global story of food, empire, and dependence. It was the moment when a route that had once promised salvation instead delivered tragedy, and when hunger wrote itself permanently into the identity of a nation and its people. The Russian Empire in the 19th century stretched across an immense geography, from the forests of Poland to the steppes of Central Asia, from the Baltic coast to the frozen tundra of Siberia. Within this space lay enormous potential for agriculture, with vast tracts of black earth soil in regions like Ukraine, fertile enough to sustain great harvests of wheat, rye and barley. Yet the promise of abundance was shadowed by persistent vulnerability. Despite its wealth of land, the empire was chronically haunted by famine. Hunger, often seasonal and cyclical, stalked the peasants who made up the majority of its population, shaping their lives, their communities, and the very structure of the state that ruled them. The roots of this problem lay deep in the nature of Russian society. Most of the population consisted of peasants who farmed strips of land within village communes known as mins. These plots were redistributed periodically, ensuring collective responsibility, but also creating inefficiency. The emancipation of the serfs in 1861 had ended centuries of bondage, but it left peasants with land allotments that were often too small, overburdened with redemption payments, and locked into a cycle of subsistence. Harvest failures struck repeatedly, and when they did not fall upon a system equipped with resilience, but upon one already near the edge of survival. Famine in Russia was not a rare calamity, it was a recurring reality. Reports of regional hunger surfaced throughout the 17th and 18th centuries, But in the 19th century, as population grew and agriculture strained against natural limits, the scale intensified. Localized shortages could quickly spread into regional crises. A dry summer in the Volga basin, or an early frost across the steppe, could erase the margin between subsistence and collapse. For millions who lived a life where bread constituted the bulk of daily calories, any disruption in grain supplies was catastrophic. One of the most devastating famines of the late 19th century struck in 1891-1892, triggered by drought, crop failure, and an early winter. It spread across the Volga region and into other provinces, affecting an estimated 35 to 40 million people. Between 375,000 and 500,000 perished. The famine revealed both the vulnerability of rural Russia and the weakness of its autocratic state. Initial government responses were hesitant. Grain exports, a pillar of imperial revenue, continued even as peasants starved. The state eventually intervened with relief measures, but much of the effort fell upon voluntary organizations, the Zemstvos, local councils and private individuals. Among them was a young Leo Tolstoy, who organized kitchens and relief projects, later writing about the suffering he witnessed in terms that would echo through Russian literature and thought. The famine of 1891 also carried political consequences. The inadequacy of the government's response undermined confidence in Tsar Alexander III's regime, exposing cracks in the image of a paternal autocracy. At the same time, the crisis energized sections of society, students, intellectuals, and landowners, who began to see famine relief not just as charity, but as a form of civic responsibility, and even political expression. The seeds of a more organized civil society were sown in the furrows of hunger. But famine did not end with 1891. Russia's agrarian system remained fragile, and hunger returned in waves during the late imperial era. Between 1901 and 1912, major famines were recorded in multiple years, including severe shortages in 1905, 1906, coinciding with revolutionary unrest. Again, millions were exposed to malnutrition, disease and death. While the government had by then established a Ministry of Agriculture and attempted reforms, most notably under Pyotr Stolypin, who sought to break up the commune system and create more independent peasant farms, these efforts were partial and slow. Many peasants resisted, clinging to traditional communal structures. Others lacked the resources to escape poverty. The early 20th century brought industrialization and urbanization, drawing grain from rural areas to feed cities and to maintain exports crucial to state finances. Grain was the empire's primary source of foreign exchange, and Russian wheat fed markets across Europe. Yet this global integration deepened local vulnerability. Villages that once might have endured a poor harvest by consuming what little remained now found their surpluses extracted, even in times of shortage, to serve the demands of empire and international trade. Hunger was thus not only a natural disaster, but a product of economic and political structures. The First World War further magnified the crisis. Mobilization disrupted agriculture, as millions of peasants were conscripted into the army. Horses, essential for plowing, were requisitioned for military use. Transportation networks were strained by war needs, making it difficult to move grain where it was needed. Inflation eroded the value of wages, and urban food shortages grew severe. By the time the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, hunger was not merely a backdrop, but a central driver of discontent. Bread, peace, land became the revolutionary slogan precisely because bread had become so scarce. The famines of the Tsarist era illustrate a tragic pattern: abundance of land yet scarcity of security, vast harvests exported abroad, while villages withered, reforms proposed yet left incomplete. Hunger was both the symptom of environmental vulnerability, drought, frost, soil exhaustion, and the product of human systems, autocracy, peasant indebtedness, and global markets. For peasants, the experience of famine was etched into memory in ways that shaped their worldview. Folklore and religious belief often framed hunger in terms of divine punishment or cosmic imbalance. Villagers held rituals to ward off drought or prayed for rain, but also blamed officials, landlords, or distant rulers. The cyclical nature of hunger fostered fatalism, but also resentment. a deep sense that the promises of rulers rarely reached the furrows of the field. Historians often see the recurring famines of late Tsarist Russia as both symptom and cause of its eventual collapse. They revealed the inability of an immense autocracy to protect its most vulnerable subjects. They demonstrated how deeply the empire's economy depended on squeezing grain from its peasantry, even at the cost of their survival. They also left behind a legacy of distrust and bitterness that revolutionary movements would later harness. In the long story of human hunger, the Russian grain famines stand out for their scale and recurrence. They remind us that famine was not confined to medieval times or distant colonies, but haunted even the heart of Europe's great powers well into the modern age. The vast breadbasket of the empire was paradoxically a land of empty tables, where the endless hunger continued to shape lives, politics and history until the very end of the Tsarist order. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the Soviet Union was undergoing one of the most radical experiments in social and economic transformation ever attempted. Under Joseph Stalin's leadership, the Soviet state sought to industrialize at unprecedented speed, financed largely through the forced extraction of grain from its vast rural hinterlands. In this process, collectivization became both an ideology and a tool. Peasant households were coerced into joining collective farms kolkhozy, where private ownership of land and animals was abolished, and agricultural output was directed according to state quotas. Ukraine, with its extraordinarily fertile black earth, the Chernozem soils that had fed empires for centuries, was central to this project. Often described as the breadbasket of Europe, Ukraine had historically been a land of abundance. Yet, in the early 1930s, abundance was transformed into emptiness, and the land of plenty became a land of starvation. The Holodomor, as it came to be called, from the Ukrainian words for hunger and plague, was the famine that swept Soviet Ukraine in 1932-1933. Unlike earlier famines caused primarily by natural disaster, the Holodomor was born of policy. Grain procurement quotas were set impossibly high by the state, requiring collective farms to deliver vast quantities to the government, regardless of actual harvest levels. Failure to meet quotas was treated not as a sign of scarcity, but as sabotage. Officials confiscated grain, seed reserves, and sometimes even household food supplies, leaving villages stripped bare. The measures were accompanied by restrictions on movement. To prevent peasants from leaving famine-stricken areas in search of food, internal passports and police controls were enforced. Villages that resisted or failed to meet quotas were blacklisted, cutting them off from supplies and trade. At the same time, grain exports from the Soviet Union continued, as Stalin sought to demonstrate strength abroad and fund industrial imports. The result was devastation. By the winter of 1932-1933, hunger spread through the Ukrainian countryside with relentless force. Families exhausted their reserves, consuming not only bread but livestock, pets and foraged roots or grass. Contemporary accounts describe people eating bark, weeds and anything remotely edible. In some of the most desperate cases, cannibalism was reported, a stark reminder of the depths to which hunger can drive human beings when survival eclipses all else. Mortality soared. Estimates vary, but most historians place the death toll between 3 and 5 million in Ukraine alone during these years. Villages were emptied, fields lay untended, and entire regions were scarred. Children were particularly vulnerable, their emaciated figures recorded in photographs that would later become haunting evidence of the catastrophe. Yet famine was not confined to Ukraine. Other regions of the Soviet Union, including Kazakhstan and parts of the North Caucasus, also suffered gravely. Still, Ukraine bore the brunt, both in terms of intensity and symbolic weight. The political dimension of the Holodomor is as central to its history as the hunger itself. For Stalin and the Soviet leadership, Ukraine represented not only a source of grain, but also a region with a strong national identity, cultural autonomy, and a history of resistance to centralized rule. The famine thus coincided with efforts to suppress Ukrainian nationalism, curtail cultural expression, and eliminate any potential challenges to Soviet authority. In this sense, many scholars argue, the famine was not merely a tragedy of mismanagement, but a deliberate act of political control, a weaponization of hunger to subdue a people. Contemporaries, of course, saw the effects long before later debates about intention emerged. Foreign journalists such as Gareth Jones reported on the devastation, though their accounts were often overshadowed by others who echoed the Soviet line, downplaying the crisis. Within the USSR itself, discussion of famine was suppressed. To acknowledge mass hunger was to admit failure in the great Soviet project of collectivization and industrialization. Silence became another layer of the disaster, as suffering unfolded without recognition or relief. The long-term consequences were immense. The demographic impact was staggering, with millions dead and countless more displaced. The trauma of famine imprinted itself on survivors, shaping memory and identity for generations. For Ukrainians, the Holodomor became not only a historical tragedy, but a defining national wound, remembered as an assault on their very existence as a people. In the broader history of famine, the Holodomor stands as a turning point. It demonstrated that hunger in the modern era could be deliberately engineered, not merely endured. While earlier famines were often attributed to nature, drought, flood, or blight, the Holodomor revealed how states could manipulate food systems to achieve political ends, with catastrophic human cost. Historians continue to debate the precise classification of the Holodomor. Many countries and scholars recognize it as genocide, arguing that the deliberate targeting of Ukrainian villages and the repression of Ukrainian culture meet the criteria. Others frame it within the context of broader Soviet famines, emphasizing structural failure and ideological rigidity. Regardless of terminology, the fact remains that millions perished in a land that had been capable of feeding millions more. Memory of the Holodomor was suppressed in the Soviet Union for decades, resurfacing only in the late 20th century, as archives opened and survivors spoke more freely. Today, monuments stand across Ukraine and in the diaspora, testifying to the famine's place in national history. It is remembered not only as a disaster of hunger, but as a stark example of how politics, ideology, and power can intertwine to create catastrophe. Thus, the Holodomor occupies a chilling place in the larger narrative of endless hunger. It was a famine where grain existed, but was taken, where fields could yield but were emptied, where food became a tool of control, and where silence added to suffering. It shows that famine in the modern age was not merely a matter of crops and climate, but of policy, ideology, and the human capacity to wield hunger as a weapon. By the time the Second World War spread into Asia, Bengal was already a region with a fragile relationship to food. Lush, green and crisscrossed by rivers, its fields supported millions through rice cultivation, yet the population density was immense, and rural poverty was entrenched. Subsistence lived perpetually on the edge of disaster. The Bengal famine of 1943, which claimed between 2 and 3 million lives, revealed how global conflict, imperial priorities, and local vulnerability could converge into catastrophe. The setting was one of disruption. Japan's rapid advances in Southeast Asia in 1941, 1942 cut off rice imports from Burma, long a crucial supplement to Bengal's supply. The loss immediately created pressure in a system already stretched thin. At the same time, wartime policies imposed by the British colonial government complicated the crisis. In order to prevent potential Japanese forces from accessing supplies should they invade Bengal, the authorities implemented a denial policy. This meant destroying boats, seizing rice stocks, and dismantling transport infrastructure in coastal areas, effectively stripping local populations of their means to store and move food. Meanwhile, the war drove inflation. Demand for resources soared, and prices of rice skyrocketed. Wealthier landowners and traders could hoard and profit, but the rural poor, sharecroppers, laborers and smallholders, suddenly found that they could no longer afford the grain on which their lives depended. Scarcity was not only a matter of harvest failure, but of access. Grain moved, but not to empty stomachs. It flowed instead to military needs, urban markets, and the hands of those who could pay. The monsoon of 1942 added another layer of fragility. Flooding and fungal disease, particularly brown spot disease in rice crops, reduced yields in key districts. The reduction was not absolute devastation, but it created a shortfall at precisely the moment when imports had vanished and speculation was rising. In this delicate web of dependency, even small reductions magnified into vast suffering. By 1943, the signs of famine were unmistakable. In the streets of Calcutta, beggars multiplied, many of them emaciated villagers who had fled the countryside in search of relief. Contemporary accounts describe skeletal figures collapsing on pavements, children too weak to cry, and corpses lying unattended until collected by municipal carts. In rural Bengal, families exhausted their resources, selling livestock, tools, or land in desperate bids to buy food. Once these were gone, nothing remained. Hunger stripped bodies, and disease followed close behind. Malaria, cholera, and dysentery swept through weakened populations, making the toll far greater than starvation alone. Relief measures, when they came, were piecemeal and inconsistent. The colonial government hesitated to acknowledge famine at first, reluctant to damage wartime morale or admit failure. Appeals for large-scale grain imports were delayed, and when shipments arrived from overseas, they often came too late to stem the worst of the crisis. Some British officials, most notoriously Winston Churchill himself, resisted diverting shipping from military use to famine relief, prioritizing the war effort over colonial civilians. Documents from the period record Churchill's dismissive remarks about Indian suffering, reflecting a wider imperial indifference that many later historians would characterize as negligence bordering on callousness. At the same time, the famine exposed deep fractures within Bengal itself. Landlords and traders were accused of hoarding and profiteering. Local relief committees struggled against corruption and inefficiency. Aid was often distributed unevenly, favoring those with connections or political leverage. While the countryside starved, food continued to move into army stores and export channels, a grim echo of earlier famines in which empire extracted sustenance even as subjects perished. The human toll was staggering. Estimates vary, but most converge around 2 to 3 million dead between 1943 and 1944. Mortality was not confined to starvation. Disease claimed at least as many as outright hunger. Entire villages were depopulated, and survivors carried the scars of trauma for generations. The famine reshaped Bengal's demographic landscape, leaving widows, orphans, and displaced populations in its wake. The political consequences were equally significant. The famine shattered illusions of imperial benevolence. For many Indians, the inability or unwillingness of British rule to prevent or relieve mass starvation reinforced calls for independence. The Indian National Congress and other nationalist groups pointed to the famine as evidence that colonial rule was not only exploitative, but deadly. Even among those not directly affected, the famine became symbolic of the vulnerability of colonial subjects in a global war that prioritized imperial power over human survival. Memory of the Bengal famine has remained contentious. For decades, it was overshadowed by the larger narratives of the Second World War and India's independence struggle. Only later did historians begin to analyze it in depth, examining the interplay of wartime disruption, colonial policy, and local vulnerability. Some frame it as a man-made famine, preventable had different choices been made. Others stress the combination of natural disaster, war, and structural poverty. In all interpretations, however, the result was the same: millions dead in a land capable of sustaining them. The famine also raises broader questions about the politics of hunger in the modern world. By the 20th century, with global trade networks, rapid transport, and organized states, famine should have been increasingly preventable. Yet in Bengal, as in Ukraine a decade earlier, food became entangled in politics, war, and empire. Hunger was not simply the absence of food, but the absence of access, shaped by power, policy, and ideology. Today, the Bengal famine of 1943 is remembered through photographs, testimonies, and scholarship, each capturing fragments of a disaster that remains both intimate and vast. It stands as one of the most severe human tragedies of the Second World War, though it unfolded far from the front lines. Its victims were not soldiers in battle, but peasants, laborers, and children, caught in the crosscurrents of global war and colonial rule. In the endless history of hunger, Bengal in 1943 reminds us that famine did not disappear with modernity. Even in an age of global networks and industrial might, millions could still die in silence, their lives weighed against ships, markets, and distant priorities. The rice fields of Bengal, green yet empty, became another chapter in the story of hunger that devoured kingdoms and empires alike. In the middle of the 20th century, China was a nation in the throes of profound transformation. Emerging from decades of war, foreign invasion, and revolution, the newly established People's Republic, under the leadership of Mao Zedong, sought to reshape its economy, society, and very conception of modernity. The Great Leap Forward, launched in 1958, was envisioned as a bold attempt to accelerate China from a primarily agrarian society into an industrial and collectivized state. Yet this grand experiment, carried out with sweeping ambition and uncompromising zeal, would culminate in one of the deadliest famines in recorded history. Between 1959 and 1961, an estimated 15 to 45 million people perished. The precise numbers remain debated, but the scale was immense, marking the Great Chinese Famine as a tragedy of unprecedented proportions. The origins of the famine lay in a convergence of ideology, policy, and environment. Mao and the Communist Party leadership envisioned a radical restructuring of agriculture. Traditional peasant farming was to be replaced with vast communes, each encompassing thousands of households. Private plots and markets were abolished, and labor was organized collectively, with the promise that efficiency, mechanization, and shared effort would yield abundance. Alongside collectivization came campaigns for rapid industrial growth, epitomized by the backyard furnaces, where peasants were ordered to produce steel, often by melting down tools, household items, and even cooking utensils. The diversion of labor from fields to industry, combined with the disruption of traditional farming practices, undermined agricultural productivity at its very roots. Compounding these structural changes were unrealistic production targets. Local officials, under pressure to demonstrate loyalty to Mao and enthusiasm for the revolution, routinely exaggerated harvest figures. Grain that did not exist on paper was nonetheless requisitioned by the state, leaving villages stripped of the food they had grown. Central warehouses and urban markets recorded abundance, while the rural households that produced the grain faced emptiness. The cycle was reinforced by political fear. To question the targets or report shortages was to risk being labeled counter-revolutionary, a dangerous charge in the political climate of the time. Thus, misinformation became institutionalized, and famine unfolded behind the facade of prosperity. Environmental stresses added to the crisis. Floods in some regions and droughts in others reduced yields further, though natural disaster alone cannot explain the magnitude of the famine. The mismanagement of irrigation projects, deforestation, and other environmental disruptions born of hasty campaigns also played their part. Yet even in years when grain production fell, enough food existed in China to feed the population at a basic level. The tragedy lay in the extraction of grain from the countryside to fulfill state quotas and maintain urban supply, leaving peasants with nothing. The human toll was staggering. In provinces like Anhui, Henan, and Sichuan, mortality soared. Families exhausted their reserves, consumed tree bark, wild grasses, or clay, and in the most desperate cases, turned to cannibalism. Eyewitness accounts describe entire villages emptied, houses collapsing from neglect, and fields abandoned because there were no able-bodied people left to work them. Malnutrition weakened immune systems, making populations vulnerable to disease, while social fabric unraveled under the strain of survival. Reports emerged of children abandoned, neighbors competing for scraps, and communities collapsing under a weight of suffering that seemed without end. Migration was restricted, as peasants were barred from leaving communes or seeking food in cities without permits. Internal controls ensured that famine remained localized, contained within the countryside. Urban residents, though affected by shortages, generally received rations, while rural populations bore the brunt of deprivation. This disparity underscored the political nature of the famine. Food distribution favored the cities and the state apparatus, leaving villages, the backbone of China's agrarian society, to endure the catastrophe. The famine was also marked by silence. Public acknowledgement was nearly impossible in the tightly controlled political environment. Local cadres concealed mortality, fearing reprisal. Newspapers printed optimistic reports of record harvests and industrial triumphs, even as millions starved. To speak openly of famine was dangerous. To complain was to risk denunciation. The catastrophe unfolded in the shadows of ideology, with suffering hidden behind slogans of progress. By 1961, however, the scale of the disaster could no longer be ignored. Grain requisitions were reduced, some communal policies were loosened, and small private plots were reinstated. The state began importing grain, quietly acknowledging the depth of the crisis. Mortality rates fell, but by then the damage was already immense, with entire cohorts of children lost, communities depopulated, and survivors marked by trauma. The consequences of the Great Chinese Famine extended far beyond the immediate years of hunger. Demographically, it caused one of the sharpest declines in population growth in modern history. Socially, it eroded trust between peasants and the state, leaving scars in rural China that would persist for decades. Politically, it triggered internal struggles within the Communist Party. While Mao retained his position, his leadership came under quiet scrutiny, and in subsequent years, others such as Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping temporarily gained influence as pragmatic approaches to recovery were adopted. Yet even this political shift was fragile, soon overturned during the upheavals of the Cultural Revolution. In historical perspective, the Great Chinese Famine stands as both a continuation and a rupture. It continued the long global pattern of hunger shaped by human systems, echoing earlier famines in Ireland, Bengal and Ukraine, where policy and power turned scarcity into catastrophe. Yet it also ruptured expectations, occurring in an era when many believed modern states had the capacity to prevent such disasters. The sheer scale of mortality, in a country of immense size and ambition, shattered assumptions about the inevitability of progress. Memory of the famine was long suppressed in China. Official narratives spoke of 3 years of natural disasters, minimizing the role of policy and leadership. Only in the late 20th century did scholars and survivors begin to piece together the scale of the tragedy through oral histories, local archives, and demographic studies. Even today, discussion remains sensitive, reflecting the political weight of the event. For those who lived through it, however, memory required no official recognition. It was written in the absences of families, the abandoned villages, and the silence of generations who had seen hunger take everything. The Great Chinese Famine thus represents one of the most immense episodes of human suffering in recorded history. It was not simply a shortage of food, but a collapse of systems, agricultural, political and social, under the weight of ideology and ambition. In the quiet fields of China, where communes once promised abundance, the reality was desolation. Hunger, again, had revealed its capacity not only to consume lives, but to expose the fragility of grand designs. In the endless chronicle of famine, the years 1959 to 1961 remain as a grim testament to the dangers of policy divorced from reality, and of ideology pursued at the expense of human survival. They remind us that hunger, even in the modern world, is not only about nature's failure, but about choices made by those in power, choices that can transform fertile soil into a landscape of death. The 20th century is often remembered for its technological advancements, industrial revolutions, and the vast mobilization of modern states, but it was also a century in which hunger was not simply the byproduct of war, but was consciously engineered as a tool of strategy, coercion, and annihilation. The idea of starvation as a weapon is not new. It reaches back into the earliest recorded sieges, when fortified towns were left to wither without supply. But in the 20th century, with its capacity for total war and mass organization, hunger was wielded on a scale never before possible. Unlike natural disasters or accidental crop failures, these famines were not merely the consequence of neglect, but the calculated use of deprivation to weaken populations, subdue resistance, or eliminate entire communities. One of the clearest examples came during the First World War, when the British naval blockade of Germany and Austria-Hungary, beginning in 1914, gradually cut off access to overseas food supplies, fertilizers and raw materials. This blockade extended across nearly the entire war, not lifted until months after the armistice in 1918. Contemporary estimates suggest that hundreds of thousands of civilians in Germany died from malnutrition and disease connected to food shortages during these years. The blockade demonstrated how industrial powers could leverage their control of seas and trade to slowly erode the strength of an enemy nation, bypassing the battlefield entirely. Food, once a symbol of sustenance and stability, became a weapon of attrition. The deliberate use of hunger was even more pronounced in the Second World War. Here, food policy was not only strategic, but ideological. Nazi Germany envisioned vast reordering of Europe under the so-called Hunger Plan, a policy developed in 1941 as part of the invasion of the Soviet Union. The plan called for the systematic diversion of food from occupied territories to sustain German forces and the home front, even if this meant the starvation of millions of civilians. Cities such as Leningrad were subjected to blockades that lasted for years, with the infamous Siege of Leningrad between 1941 and 1944 reducing rations to such meager portions that residents survived on sawdust bread, wallpaper paste, and whatever scraps could be scavenged from the urban environment. The death toll from hunger and cold in Leningrad alone reached over 1 million people. Beyond the siege, in Ukraine and other Soviet lands under German occupation, agricultural produce was seized and redirected, leaving the local population to perish. The Hunger Plan, combined with broader policies of ethnic cleansing and genocide, blurred the line between military necessity and extermination. Hunger was not incidental. It was a deliberate method of weakening populations, stripping them of resistance, and making room for ideological visions of settlement and conquest. At the same time, the Soviet Union itself employed hunger as a weapon in its internal and external wars. During Stalin's earlier years, famine had already been manipulated through collectivization, culminating in the Holodomor in Ukraine. During the Second World War, however, Soviet military strategy also relied on scorched earth tactics, destroying food stores, crops, and livestock as they retreated before the advancing German army, leaving nothing for invaders to consume. Civilians caught in this devastation faced starvation, a consequence of defensive strategy as much as offensive. Hunger thus became entangled in a brutal cycle, used by both sides as an inescapable companion of war. Later in the century, the use of hunger shifted into the realm of civil wars, decolonization conflicts, and Cold War interventions. In Nigeria during the Biafran War, 1967-1970, food was weaponized with devastating clarity. After the secession of Biafra, the Nigerian government imposed a blockade, cutting off food and medicine to the region. Images of starving children, their bodies marked by kwashiorkor and other diseases of malnutrition, spread across the world. Humanitarian organizations attempted airlifts, but the blockade persisted, making famine both a tactic and a consequence of the conflict. For the first time, television broadcast the sight of engineered starvation into homes across Europe and America, sparking debates about humanitarian intervention and the politics of food relief. In Ethiopia during the late 20th century, hunger again became entangled with war. Both during the 1983-1985 famine and subsequent conflicts, the withholding or distribution of food aid was manipulated as a tool of loyalty and control. Villages accused of supporting rebels often found themselves deprived of relief, while others were relocated in campaigns that exacerbated scarcity. In Sudan, Somalia, and other regions riven by civil conflict, armed groups blockaded aid convoys, looted supplies, and used food as bargaining chips in negotiations. Here hunger was less about destroying a distant enemy than about maintaining dominance over local populations and shaping the dynamics of warlordism. The Cold War itself played a subtle but important role in the weaponization of hunger. Food aid became an instrument of diplomacy, with the United States and Soviet Union using grain shipments to reward allies, punish adversaries, and project ideological legitimacy. To receive or withhold food was not simply a humanitarian matter, but a signal of global alignment. Hunger once more was tied to power. The weaponization of hunger left deep scars not only in bodies but in memory. In Leningrad, survivors remembered hunger not as an abstract shortage, but as a daily erasure of dignity, where people boiled leather belts into soup or consumed the glue from furniture. In Biafra, hunger was not only a tool of war, but a spectacle photographed and broadcast, becoming a symbol of modern famine in the public imagination. In Ethiopia, memories of hunger were tied to both state failure and external manipulation, making trust in institutions fragile for decades to come. In the broader history of famine, hunger as a weapon represents the starkest reminder of how food can be stripped of its essential human purpose and transformed into an instrument of cruelty. Unlike drought or flood, war-induced famine arises not from the indifference of nature, but from deliberate calculation. Its victims are not collateral, but targets. And in the 20th century, with the capacity to transport, store, and distribute food on a global scale, the choice to starve populations was never a matter of necessity, but of intent. As the century closed, international law sought to recognize these truths. The Geneva Conventions and subsequent protocols listed the starvation of civilians as a prohibited tactic of war, yet enforcement has remained inconsistent. In conflicts from the Balkans to Yemen in the 21st century, echoes of 20th century strategies still resonate, reminding us that hunger remains an accessible and devastating weapon. Thus, hunger in the 20th century was no longer only the shadow of harvest cycles, economic collapse, or mismanagement. It was also the product of decision, strategy, and deliberate cruelty. In the arsenal of war, it stood alongside bullets and bombs, invisible yet equally destructive, capable of dissolving societies quietly, inexorably, and irreversibly. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, humanity entered an age defined by abundance on one side and scarcity on the other. For the first time in recorded history, the global capacity to produce food exceeded the basic caloric needs of the world's population. Modern agriculture, with its mechanization, synthetic fertilizers, hybrid crops, irrigation systems, and transnational trade, ensured that there was, in theory, enough to feed everyone. Yet, paradoxically, famine did not disappear. Instead, hunger remained, quiet but insistent, no longer always the catastrophic spectacle of empty fields and skeletal figures that had haunted earlier centuries, but rather a silent shadow woven into the fabric of global inequality, conflict, and governance. In many ways, modern famine reveals itself not as an inevitable failure of harvest, but as a failure of distribution, politics, and access. The earth grows more grain, rice, and maize than ever before. Warehouses store surplus stockpiles. Global markets operate with the speed of satellites and container ships. And yet, millions of people go to bed hungry each night, not because the food does not exist, but because they cannot reach it, afford it, or secure it amidst instability. The tragedy of hunger in the modern era is less about the absence of food than about the persistence of barriers that prevent it from reaching those who need it most. The late 20th century saw the emergence of international organizations designed to combat this contradiction. The World Food Programme, established in 1961, became the largest humanitarian organization dedicated to addressing hunger. Alongside it, agencies like the Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO, and countless non-governmental bodies developed networks for relief, development, and research. Advances in logistics meant that emergency rations could be airlifted into disaster zones within days. Fortified foods could address malnutrition with efficiency unknown to earlier centuries. Yet, despite these infrastructures, famine continued to appear, not as a constant global plague, but as recurrent eruptions in places where politics and conflict overrode the capacity for distribution. The Horn of Africa became emblematic of this modern paradox. In Ethiopia in the 1980s, Images of starving children broadcast on television sparked global charity campaigns, raising unprecedented levels of awareness and aid. But the underlying conditions, war, authoritarian governance, environmental stress and poverty, ensured that hunger returned in cycles. Somalia, in the early 1990s, demonstrated the fragility of humanitarian systems, where civil war and the collapse of central authority left food aid vulnerable to armed groups. Hunger in these contexts was no longer just the absence of food but the presence of violence, corruption, and instability that prevented food from serving its essential role. Elsewhere, hunger became tied to displacement. The late 20th and early 21st centuries witnessed unprecedented movements of refugees, driven by civil war, ethnic conflict, and climate stress. In camps from Darfur to Cox's Bazar, food distribution became the cornerstone of survival, yet also a source of dependency and vulnerability. Where supplies faltered, hunger re-emerged, often invisible to the wider world, as international attention shifted elsewhere. Climate change has begun to add a new dimension to the persistence of famine. Droughts in the Sahel, floods in South Asia, and shifting rainfall patterns across equatorial regions disrupt harvests in ways that amplify existing fragilities. While global trade theoretically smooths local shortages by moving grain across continents, the poorest regions remain tethered to the vagaries of weather. For subsistence farmers in places like South Sudan or Yemen, the promise of global abundance is distant. What matters is whether the next harvest will last until the following season, or whether violence or drought will intervene once again. The persistence of hunger in modern times also reflects economic inequality. In nations where wealth and food are abundant, waste is staggering. Millions of tons of edible food discarded each year in supermarkets and households. In contrast, in regions of poverty, families ration meals, substitute with less nutritious foods, or forego food entirely. Malnutrition, in its modern form, often wears a double face. In some places, undernutrition leads to wasting and stunting. In others, diets dominated by cheap processed calories result in obesity, itself a form of nutritional imbalance. Hunger, then, has become not only a question of scarcity, but also of quality and distribution, creating a spectrum of malnutrition that affects billions worldwide. Conflicts of the 21st century continue to demonstrate how hunger remains a weapon. In Yemen, years of civil war and blockade have created one of the world's worst humanitarian crises, with millions dependent on food aid. In Syria, siege warfare deliberately starved neighborhoods into submission. In the Tigray region of Ethiopia, accusations of deliberate obstruction of food deliveries echo the patterns of earlier centuries, showing how starvation remains a tool of war, despite international prohibitions. Modern famine, however, is often quieter than its predecessors. It unfolds not in sudden collapses, but in chronic undernourishment, where children grow without enough protein, vitamins or minerals, leading to lifelong consequences. It is measured less by mass graves than by statistics of stunting, anemia, or reduced life expectancy. In this way, hunger today is both more insidious and less visible, diffused across continents, woven into the daily lives of billions, and hidden behind the normalcy of global abundance. The destiny of nations continues to be shaped by hunger. States weakened by food insecurity face unrest, migration pressures, and dependency on external aid. Entire generations raised in conditions of malnutrition struggle with reduced cognitive and physical development, undermining national productivity and social stability. Hunger today is not merely a humanitarian concern, but a political and economic one, influencing the trajectories of countries across Africa, South Asia, and beyond. And yet there is a certain silence that surrounds modern hunger. Unlike the spectacular famines of the past, modern famine is often a matter of absence rather than visibility. It is hidden in rural villages, where crops fail quietly, in urban slums where wages do not cover rising food prices, in refugee camps where rations are cut due to donor fatigue. It lacks the drama of ancient inscriptions, of medieval chronicles, or of the grain riots that once shook cities. Instead, it persists as a background condition, normalized yet devastating, as though humanity has become accustomed to living alongside it. even in an age when it could, in principle, be eliminated. The story of hunger, therefore, remains unfinished. From the Fertile Crescent to the Great Wall, from the Nile to the streets of Leningrad, from Ireland to Bengal, hunger has been a constant companion to civilization, shaping its rise and fall. The 21st century holds the capacity to break this pattern, for the resources and knowledge exist to feed the global population. But whether this capacity will be matched by political will, by equitable distribution, and by resilience against conflict and climate, remains uncertain. Hunger endures not because it must, but because it has been allowed to. As nations look ahead, hunger continues to cast its shadow. It is not the catastrophic end of civilizations as in antiquity, nor the collapse of empires as in earlier centuries, but a persistent undermining, a quiet erosion. And so, in the silence of today, hunger waits, not as a natural inevitability, but as a choice unmade, an injustice unresolved, and a reminder that abundance without access is no abundance at all.